It was the start of September when I decided to rent a remote cabin in northern Washington, close to the Canadian border. I had been burned out from work and needed to disconnect from everything. The cabin was listed on a quiet site, owned by an old couple who didn't even use email. I had to call them to book it, and I had to mail them a deposit check. That should have been my first clue that this place was going to be different. I drove up early on a Monday morning, my old Honda loaded with supplies, non-perishable food, water, firewood, a basic toolkit, a generator, and a couple changes of clothes. The drive was quiet. I passed fewer and fewer cars as the road narrowed and twisted through pine-covered hills. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road that had no signage, only a hand-painted number nailed to a tree. It was another 4 miles of that before I reached the cabin. It was simple, one story with a sloped roof and a porch that wrapped around the front. The wood was gray from age, and vines had begun to crawl up one side. There was no cell signal, no neighbors, just trees and silence. I liked that. I wanted that. No distractions. No one to bother me. Inside was even simpler. One room served as the kitchen, living space, and bedroom. A cast iron stove sat in the corner, and a small table with 2 chairs was pushed up against the window. There was no fridge, only a cooler and a couple of cabinets for food. I unpacked, set everything in place, and sat down on the porch, watching the wind move through the trees. The first day passed without anything worth noting. I made dinner over the fire pit outside, read a little, then went to sleep early. The bed was stiff, but after the long drive and fresh air, I slept hard. I woke up around 6 the next morning, the sky still gray and cool. I boiled water for coffee, then set out on a short walk. The land around the cabin was wild. No clear trails, just stretches of pine forest, moss-covered rocks, and thick undergrowth. I carried a compass and a whistle just in case. I didn't plan to go far, but something about the quiet out there made me want to keep walking. Everything felt still. I kept going until I realized I had wandered more than a mile from the cabin. I turned around and walked back, marking a few trees on the way with a piece of red cloth I'd brought. By the 3rd day, I had settled into a routine. Wake up, make coffee, explore a little, return to the cabin, cook dinner, read, sleep. I started chopping wood to keep busy. The silence had become comforting. Then things started to feel a little off. It was small at first. I had a folding knife I kept on the kitchen table. I always kept it in the same spot. One morning, it wasn't there. I searched the table, then the floor, then my bags. Eventually, I found it inside the kitchen drawer where I kept canned food. I thought maybe I had put it there absent-mindedly, but I couldn't remember doing it. That same night, I thought I heard something outside, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on gravel. I turned off the lantern and listened. I stood there for several minutes, heart thumping, before I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe wind in the trees. Still, I slept lightly that night. The next day, I noticed marks in the dirt around the fire pit. Not tracks exactly, but lines like someone had dragged a stick or a boot through the dirt. It circled the pit twice. I hadn't noticed it the night before, and I hadn't walked around it myself. I stood there for a while, staring at it, wondering. By the end of the week, I started locking the cabin door at night. I knew no one was supposed to be out here, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I hadn't seen a soul since I got there, not even a plane in the sky. Then came the 8th night. That was when it turned bad. I had just finished eating and was outside washing my pot with bottled water when I saw something through the trees. A flash of movement, something light-colored, maybe cloth. I froze. I waited, scanning the tree line. Nothing. I listened for sounds, twigs breaking, leaves rustling, but everything was still. I finished quickly and went back inside, locking the door. I sat with the lantern low and watched out the window for an hour. Nothing moved. I eventually laid down, but I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard the sound again, gravel crunching outside. This time it wasn't soft. It was clear, steady footsteps. My blood went cold. I sat up slowly, not even breathing. The steps circled the cabin. I didn't move. I heard them pause on the porch. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would echo. Then I heard the wooden step creak. One step, then another. I reached for the knife and held it in my hand. Then the footsteps stopped. I didn't sleep that night. To first light, I opened the door. The porch looked normal. I stepped out and scanned the area. Nothing, but in the dirt near the steps were footprints. Bare feet, adult-sized. The prints circled the cabin twice. I followed them a few feet into the trees. Then they just stopped, like whoever made them had vanished. I packed up some of my gear and put it in the car. I didn't leave, but I wanted to be ready if I needed to. I stayed inside that day, reading, checking the windows, keeping the knife close. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, I found something worse. Near the back of the cabin, nailed to a tree, was a dead rabbit. Its body was pinned to the trunk with a rusty nail, its stomach sliced open. The cuts were precise, not the work of an animal. It had been placed there. For me, I went back inside and locked the door. I knew I had to leave. I shoved everything I could into bags, started the generator, and turned on my phone. Still no signal. I grabbed the car keys and ran outside. That was when I saw the man. He was standing about 50 feet away, just past the tree line. Thin, shirtless, with wild dark hair. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching me. I froze. I felt like I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then I forced myself to back into the car. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't look back until I was already down the dirt road. It took me 3 hours to reach a town. I drove straight to the police station. They took my report and sent an officer to check the cabin. 2 days later, they called me. They found the cabin. They found the rabbit. But they didn't find the man. They also found a small shelter deeper in the woods, about half a mile from the cabin. It was built from branches and a tarp, hidden under dense brush. Inside were bones, small animal skulls, and a pile of clothing. None of it was mine. They never found out who the man was. They said maybe he was living out there, off the grid. Maybe he was dangerous. Maybe not. But they couldn't arrest someone they hadn't found. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked for the deposit back. It took me a long time to sleep through the night again. Every time I close my eyes, I see that man's face, standing in the trees, watching. And I wonder how long he had been out there, watching me, walking around the cabin at night, moving my things, leaving messages, waiting. I had rented a small wooden cabin deep in the forest of northern Montana. It was the second week of September 2019. The air was already turning crisp, and the trees around the region were starting to show signs of orange and yellow. I was 34 years old at the time and had taken 2 weeks off from work. I needed a break from the city, the noise, and the constant stress. I had planned to spend the time alone, reading, hiking, and just disconnecting from everything for a bit. The cabin I picked was on a piece of private land I found through an online listing. It was about 45 minutes away from the nearest town, and even that was just a tiny place with a diner, a gas station, and a few stores. The cabin had no internet, no cable TV, and barely any cell reception unless I climbed a nearby hill. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long but scenic. I drove through winding roads surrounded by thick trees, past a few rivers and scattered meadows. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures online. It was simple, with one main room, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a loft area with a bed. There was a porch out front and a fire pit a few feet away. Beyond that, it was just forest. I spent the first few days doing exactly what I came for. I read on the porch, made coffee on the little stove, and walked the nearby trails with a small backpack. I saw deer a few times and heard owls at night. The air smelled like pine and wet dirt, and the only sounds I heard at night were from crickets and the occasional rustling in the trees. But around the 5th day, things started to feel off. It began with small things. I noticed a few boot prints in the dirt path behind the cabin that weren't mine. They looked fresh. At first, I thought maybe they were old and had just become more visible because of the rain the night before. But I had walked that same path the day before and didn't remember seeing them. The next day, I noticed the cabin door wasn't fully shut when I came back from a hike. I always made sure to lock it when I left, and it wasn't like the wind could blow it open because it was a heavy wooden door. Nothing inside seemed touched or out of place, though. I checked all my stuff. My backpack, my phone, my wallet, and all my gear were there. Still, I felt uneasy. That night, I kept the porch light on, even though it barely lit anything past the first few steps. The following morning, I found what looked like cigarette butts near the fire pit. I don't smoke, and there were none there before. That confirmed to me that someone had come near the cabin. I looked around for any more signs but found nothing. I didn't hear anything strange during the night. No footsteps, no cars, no voices. Just the usual forest sounds. That day, I didn't go hiking. I stayed near the cabin, kept my boots on, and stayed alert. I felt like I was being watched. And even though I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia from being alone so long, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept looking out the windows, especially the back one that faced the trees. Around late afternoon, I walked around the cabin's perimeter to make sure everything looked normal. I found a piece of string tied around a branch near the back of the cabin. It was red, frayed, and about a foot long. It didn't look like something from nature. I untied it and brought it inside. That night, I blocked the door with a chair and kept a kitchen knife under my pillow. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound outside. It was quick, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I stayed completely still and listened. A few seconds passed, then I heard it again, this time closer. I quietly got out of bed, grabbed the knife, and moved to the loft railing where I could peek out one of the small windows that looked over the porch. I saw nothing at first. Then something moved near the edge of the trees. It was too dark to see clearly, but it looked like a person. They weren't walking toward the cabin. They were just standing there. I waited, heart pounding, barely breathing. After a few minutes, they slowly turned and walked back into the trees. I stayed up the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up a few things, locked the cabin, and hiked up the hill to get signal. I called the property owner, told him someone had been trespassing, and that I wasn't comfortable staying there anymore. He sounded surprised but told me I could leave early and he'd refund the rest of the days. I grabbed my gear, locked up, and drove straight back to the nearest town. I didn't stop until I was halfway back to the city. I kept looking in the rearview mirror the entire time, expecting to see someone following me, but the road stayed empty. It's been years since that trip, and I've never gone back. I don't know who that person was or what they wanted, or how long they had been watching me. I never found any cameras, and nothing of mine was stolen. But I know what I saw. I know someone was out there and they had come close. Too close. I've stayed in cabins since then, but always in places where there are neighbors or at least a ranger station nearby. I learned that even when you think you're completely alone out there, you never really are. I had been needing a break from everything. The city, the noise, the constant push of deadlines and people and traffic. It was all starting to wear me down. I had started feeling like a machine. Wake up, rush to work, stare at a screen, rush home, sleep, and repeat. I needed space, real space. I needed quiet, the kind that didn't buzz with electricity or hum with engines. So I rented a cabin up in the northern part of the state. It was far from the nearest town and backed up against a stretch of thick, wild forest. The pictures online showed a simple wooden structure with a small porch, a chimney, and big windows that faced the woods. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a bed, a bathroom, a wood-burning stove, and a few basic supplies. It was exactly what I was looking for. I packed light, a backpack, some clothes, a few books, and a cooler with food. I had bought a big jug of water and a small water filter just in case. I wanted to be alone, but I didn't want to be reckless. The road to the cabin turned from pavement to gravel and then to dirt. It twisted up into the hills, past empty fields and tall pines. I didn't see another car after the first hour. Eventually, my phone lost signal completely. When I got there, it was early afternoon. The air was cool. The sky was gray with low-hanging clouds, and everything smelled like pine and wet earth. The cabin was just like the pictures. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by trees. The ground was soft with old leaves and moss. There was a fire pit out front and a narrow trail that disappeared into the woods. Inside, it was clean but basic. A single bed with flannel sheets, a small kitchen with a propane stove, and a narrow bathroom with a composting toilet and a metal basin for washing up. The stove was made of iron, and a neat stack of firewood sat beside it. I lit a small fire to take the edge off the chill. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The quiet was complete. No sirens, no people yelling outside my window, no distant rumble of traffic. Just wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It took a little time to adjust, but once I did, it was like I had melted into the bed. I spent the next couple days hiking short trails, reading on the porch, and chopping a bit of firewood. I didn't go far. I knew better than to wander deep into the forest alone. Still, I couldn't help but wonder where those trails went. Some of them weren't marked at all, just faint indentations in the undergrowth, as if deer or maybe old hunters had worn them down long ago. It was the fourth day when things started to feel different. I was standing at the edge of the clearing, where the grass met the tree line, sipping coffee from a tin mug. The forest in front of me was still and quiet. Too quiet. Normally, I heard birds in the morning, squirrels darting through the brush, branches swaying overhead. But that morning, nothing. Not even wind. Just a heavy stillness, like the trees were holding their breath. I brushed it off. Maybe a storm was coming. Maybe the animals were hunkering down. I went back inside, made breakfast, and read for a while. Around noon, I decided to check one of the deeper trails. I had brought a compass and a printed map of the area, plus a small day pack with snacks and a knife. I figured I'd be back before dark. The trail I chose was narrower than the others. It bent and curved unpredictably, weaving between tall pines and fallen logs. At some points, it disappeared completely, swallowed by ferns and damp leaves, only to reappear a few feet ahead. I kept track of my direction with the compass, checking behind me every now and then to make sure I remembered the way back. I walked for maybe an hour before I found the clearing. It was odd. The trees opened up suddenly, like a wide circle had been cut out of the forest. The grass inside was short, almost too uniform, like it had been tended to. In the middle stood a structure. Not a cabin, not a shed. It looked like an old wooden frame, maybe part of a barn or a large animal pen. The wood was dark with age, and parts of it had collapsed. Rusted wire hung from some of the beams. I stopped at the edge of the clearing and just stared. Something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but out of place. I walked around the edge, not stepping into the grass, just circling it. There were no signs of recent activity. No trash, no tools, no tire tracks. Just that weathered frame, leaning and broken. I turned back and followed my path to the cabin. The whole walk back, I kept feeling like I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves, but I started glancing over my shoulder more than usual. Once I stopped and listened. Nothing, not even wind. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing sounds outside. Not animals or wind, just soft, rhythmic noises, like someone walking slowly around the cabin. I didn't have curtains, so I got up and blew out the lanterns, hoping the darkness would hide me. I didn't go outside. I didn't want to know. The next morning, I found tracks. Human tracks. Bare feet, wide set, pressed deep into the soft earth around the cabin. They went from the tree line to the front porch, circled the cabin, and then vanished into the woods. No shoes, no other markings, just footprints. I didn't have cell signal. I couldn't call anyone. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was a few hours away, and the road was narrow and rough. I told myself it could have been a hiker, someone lost, or just curious. I locked the door, even though the lock was weak, and kept the knife nearby. The second night was worse. The sounds came back. Not walking this time. Breathing. Slow, deep breaths just outside the window. Then silence. Then a soft scratch on the wall, like fingers dragging across the wood. I didn't move. I lay still for hours, heart pounding, until dawn broke. When I opened the door in the morning, I found another footprint. This one was inside the porch, right by the door. I knew I had locked it. I checked again. The door wasn't damaged. The windows weren't broken. But someone had been inside the porch, maybe trying the handle, maybe just standing there. I packed my things. I decided to leave a day early. I didn't want to stay another night. I loaded up the cooler, shut the stove, double-checked the fire was out, and locked the cabin behind me. I kept my knife close as I walked to the car. I turned the key. The engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead. I opened the hood and looked around. The cables were cut. Not chewed, not frayed. Cleanly sliced. My heart sank. I was stuck. No signal, no car. No one expecting me for another day. I thought about walking, but the road was long and twisted. It would take me most of the day, maybe more, and I wasn't sure I'd make it before dark. I spent the rest of the day inside, sitting by the window, knife in hand. I barely ate. I kept the fire going, but low so the smoke wouldn't give away that I was still there. That night, I didn't light any lamps. I just sat in the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin, then stopped by the door. This time, the handle turned back and forth slowly, gently. I held my breath. I could feel my own heartbeat in my throat. The handle stopped. Then the footsteps moved to the back of the cabin. Then silence. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed a bag with water and snacks, took the knife and compass, and left on foot. I didn't take the road. I cut through the woods, moving fast and quiet, trying to stay off any visible trail. I used the compass to head south, toward where I thought the nearest town was. I walked for hours. The forest felt endless. I didn't see signs of people, just trees and rocks and the occasional bird. Then I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Fast. I started running. I didn't look back. I just ran, jumping over roots and pushing through branches. My lungs burned. My legs ached, but I kept moving. Eventually, I burst out of the trees onto a dirt road. An old truck was coming toward me, slow and rattling. I waved, shouted, and the driver stopped. He was an older man, thin, with a long beard and a worn jacket. He looked surprised to see me. He gave me a ride to the nearest town. I didn't say much, just that I had gotten lost hiking, that my car had broken down. He nodded, didn't press. I called a friend from a payphone. They drove hours to pick me up. I reported the cabin to the rental site. They took the listing down. I never found out who had been out there or what they wanted. The police said they'd send someone to check it, but I never heard back. I haven't gone camping since. I still like the idea of being in nature, of being alone in the woods, but not like that. Never again like that. I still think about the footsteps, the breathing, the footprints by the door. Someone was out there watching, waiting, and if my battery hadn't been cut, I might have driven away thinking it was all in my head. But it wasn't. It was real. It was late September when I decided to take a break from everything and drive up north to a remote cabin I found online. I'd been feeling burned out from work and needed to disconnect. My phone barely worked in the city, so I figured a week in the woods with no signal would be good for my mind. The pictures looked perfect. Old wooden place tucked into the trees, near a lake with nothing around for miles. That was exactly what I was looking for. No people, no noise, no distractions. The drive was long. I took a couple back roads once I got out of the city and followed a gravel path that snaked into the woods. It started to get rough toward the end. My tires kept spitting up rocks, and some parts were so narrow the trees scraped against my side mirrors. I started to wonder if I took a wrong turn. But then I saw the old wooden sign nailed to a pine tree, Hemlock Ridge. That was the name of the place on the rental site. The cabin came into view a few minutes later. It looked older in person than in the pictures, and the wood was a bit more worn. The porch sagged in the middle and the windows were dusty. Still, it looked solid. I parked my car on the patch of dirt off to the side, got out, and stretched. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Inside, the cabin was basic but comfortable. There was a small kitchen, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft where the bed was. A single bathroom sat off to the side. Everything creaked. The wood floor under my boots sounded like it hadn't been stepped on in years. There were small things that made it feel abandoned. Dust on the table, cobwebs in the corners, an old calendar still open to May. I unpacked my things and tried to settle in. The sun started to set, so I gathered some firewood stacked outside and got a fire going. I cooked a simple dinner, sat outside on the porch with a can of beer, and listened to the sounds of the forest. At least I tried to, but there wasn't much. No birds, no insects, just wind moving through the trees. That night I had trouble sleeping. The mattress upstairs was thin and old, and the forest made noises I wasn't used to. Branches cracked somewhere outside. Once or twice I thought I heard something brushing against the side of the cabin. I got up once to check, stepping outside with a flashlight, but I didn't see anything, just the woods and my car. By morning, I figured I was just paranoid from being alone. I made coffee, grabbed my pack, and set out for a hike. There was a narrow trail that led behind the cabin, which I followed for about an hour. I didn't see anyone, not a soul, just trees, moss, and a couple squirrels. I took a few photos, sat on a log to eat some trail mix, then turned back. Back at the cabin, things felt different. It was probably in my head, but I had the strange feeling that something had been moved. Nothing big, but one of my boots was tilted differently near the door, and I could have sworn the cabin door wasn't locked when I left. I told myself I must have locked it out of habit. Still, I went room to room just to check. Everything looked the same, nothing missing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I kept the fire going longer. I didn't like the dark, and the cabin didn't have any curtains. Every window felt like a hole in the wall. I felt watched. When I finally crawled into bed, I lay there for a while, just listening. Wind, the creaking of wood, then something else. Footsteps, slow, heavy steps, not right next to the cabin, but off in the woods. Far enough to be unclear, but close enough to hear. They stopped after a few seconds. Then silence. I lay there staring at the dark ceiling for a long time. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I walked the area around the cabin. There was a small slope that led down to the lake, so I walked along the edge and looked for tracks. I thought maybe an animal, maybe a deer, but I saw something strange near the back of the cabin. A deep scuff in the dirt, like someone had dragged their heel. No boot tread, just that one mark. It led off into the trees. I followed it for a little bit, but the trail vanished quickly into the brush. I came back and sat on the porch for a while, staring into the woods. I started to regret coming out here. It wasn't relaxing anymore. It didn't feel like a break. On the fourth night, I woke up to a noise on the porch, a dull creak. It sounded like weight shifting on one of the wooden boards. I stayed in bed, holding my breath. Then I heard it again, a slow, steady step, then another. I reached over to grab my flashlight but froze when I heard the doorknob rattle. Just once, like someone tested it. I sat there in the dark for almost an hour, staring at the stairs, flashlight in hand. I wanted to go down and check, but I couldn't move. When I finally did, I stayed inside. I checked the door. It was still locked. I peeked out the windows but didn't see anyone. In the morning, I found something on the porch that wasn't there before. A small stone, perfectly round, sitting dead center. It didn't make any sense. I hadn't seen any stones like that on the property. I picked it up and threw it into the woods. The rest of the day, I felt jumpy. Every sound outside made me turn my head. I double-checked all the windows and doors. I considered leaving, but I still had 3 days left on the rental. I didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I imagined it. I kept telling myself that. But that night, things escalated. It was around 1 a.m. when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer. I sat up in bed and listened. They circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I heard the porch creak again, and then a tapping sound against the wall. Not loud, just enough to be heard. Tap, 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 like someone dragging their fingers. I got up and walked down the stairs with the flashlight. I didn't turn it on right away. I just stood in the dark kitchen, staring at the front door. The tapping stopped. Everything went quiet. Then the doorknob turned. Not just a quick test like before. Turned hard. It rattled in the frame. Whoever was outside wanted in. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the door. It stopped. Silence again. I waited. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps walking away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the chair with the flashlight in my lap until the sun came up. That morning, I packed my things. I wasn't going to stay another night. I walked around the cabin one last time. That's when I found the marks. On the back wall of the cabin, near the ground, there were deep scratches in the wood. Not animal claws. Straight lines like someone took a knife and carved into the logs. 3 vertical lines, almost like tally marks. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I loaded up the car and took off down the dirt path. I drove faster than I should have, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. It took almost half a day to get back to the nearest town. I found a gas station, filled up, and sat there for a while trying to collect myself. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't file a report. What would I even say? A week later, back at home, I got curious. I went online and looked up Hemlock Ridge. The listing was gone. The owner's name wasn't listed anymore either. I tried searching the area, and I found a blog post from a hiker who had passed through the same woods a year earlier. He mentioned something strange in his post. He said he found a cabin deep in the woods with no sign of anyone living there. Said the door was wide open, but inside it looked like someone had just left. Firewood stacked, dishes in the sink, boots by the door. He thought about staying the night, but said he got a bad feeling and left. His post ended with a photo. It was the same cabin, same porch, same lake, except in his photo there was something else, just barely visible behind a tree. A figure, dressed in black, standing still. I never went back. I still think about it, though. I wonder how long he had been out there, watching, waiting. I wonder what would have happened if I stayed one more night. Sometimes, when it gets really quiet at night, I hear things. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. But maybe it's just in my head. Maybe. Work had been piling up for months, and I hadn't taken time off in over a year. I worked in logistics, which meant long hours staring at spreadsheets, dealing with late deliveries, and answering emails deep into the night. My eyes were constantly tired, my back always stiff, and my patience paper thin. So when my supervisor finally approved a 2-week vacation, I didn't waste a second. I booked a remote cabin I found on a small rental site. It wasn't even on the major booking platforms, just a simple web page with a handful of photos. The listing said it was off a service road near the base of Mount Reynolds, not far from a lake and some hiking trails. There was no cell signal, no internet, no TV, just a wood stove, a propane range, and an outhouse. I figured the lack of digital distractions would help me unwind. I left the city on a Sunday morning in late October. The trees were past their brightest colors, but the hills were still golden and orange. I made good time, only stopping for gas and snacks. The last 30 miles were on narrow mountain roads, with no traffic, just switchbacks and steep drops. The directions said to turn off at a wooden sign that read Fire Road 7 and follow the gravel road for 4 miles. The gravel road was rough. Deep ruts and loose rocks kept me under 15 miles per hour. My car, a compact sedan, wasn't made for off-roading, and I scraped the undercarriage more than once. But after crawling through dense forest for what felt like forever, the road opened up into a small clearing, and there it was. The cabin was small, just 1 story with dark wood siding and a metal roof. A short wooden porch ran along the front, with a single chair and a small table. There were no other buildings in sight, and no sounds except the breeze through the trees. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows. Felt peaceful, isolated but peaceful. Inside, it was exactly as advertised. 1 large room with a bed in the corner, a small kitchenette with a propane stove and a hand pump for water, a table with 2 chairs, and a fireplace against the far wall. There were a few shelves with dry goods, basic cookware, and a bundle of firewood stacked neatly next to the stove. I unpacked, lit the stove to take off the chill, and settled in for what I hoped would be a quiet retreat. The first 2 days went by smoothly. I hiked a bit, read a book I'd been meaning to finish, and took long naps. There was a heavy rainstorm on the second night, and I woke up once to the sound of wind rattling the windows, but I fell back asleep quickly. The peace and quiet were doing their job. By the third day, I started noticing small things. The first was the metal trash bin behind the cabin. When I arrived, it had been closed and latched. I was sure of it because I remembered struggling with the latch when I tossed in some wrappers. But that morning, it was open. Not just the lid flipped up, but the whole latch unhooked. I figured it might have been the wind or an animal, so I resecured it and thought little of it. That afternoon, I went for a hike along the ridge trail. It was a moderate climb, about 2 miles up to a good overlook. I brought my backpack, some water, and a sandwich. When I got to the top, I sat on a flat rock and ate. The view stretched out over the treetops. No houses, no roads, just endless forest. I stayed up there for about an hour. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The firewood stack looked different. Some pieces were missing. I hadn't touched it since I arrived. I counted 6 logs the first night when I made a fire, and there had been at least 10 left. Now it looked like only 4 remained. I searched around the cabin, thinking maybe an animal had dragged some away, but I didn't see any tracks or signs. The dirt was still wet from the rain, so it should have shown something. That made me uneasy. I made another fire that night and locked the door. It was a simple latch and bolt, not much more than what you'd find on a garden shed, but it gave me a bit of comfort. The next morning, I woke up to a sound outside. It was still early, barely light. A slow, dragging noise against the porch. I stayed in bed for a few minutes, holding my breath. The noise stopped. When I finally got up and opened the door, nothing was there, but the chair on the porch had been moved. It was turned to face the woods instead of the door. I hadn't touched it since I got there. I started feeling watched. I know how that sounds, but it wasn't just paranoia. I felt it. Every time I stepped outside, I had the sense that someone was nearby. Not close, not right behind me, but somewhere just beyond the trees. I stopped hiking after that. I stayed near the cabin and kept the fire going during the day. I didn't know if I was overreacting or if something was really happening. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with the covers pulled up, listening to every creak and pop of the wood stove. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to a sharp bang against the cabin wall. It sounded like someone had hit the side of the building with a stick or a rock. I didn't go outside. I stayed still, heart pounding. A few minutes later, another bang, closer to the door this time, then silence. When daylight came, I opened the door slowly. There were marks on the cabin wall, long scratches in the wood, like someone had dragged something sharp across it. Not deep, but fresh. I walked the perimeter. No tracks, no broken branches, just those scratches. That was the turning point. I decided to leave. I packed everything up by noon and loaded the car. The gravel road was still wet and slick from rain earlier in the week. I drove slowly, heart racing. Every twist in the road made me nervous. But about a mile in, I hit a rut too hard, and the car bottomed out with a crunch. The engine kept running, but when I tried to drive forward, the front wheels just spun. I got out and checked underneath. The oil pan had cracked, and fluid was leaking onto the ground. I was stuck. No cell signal, no GPS, just forest and 4 miles of road back to the cabin. I thought about walking all the way to the main road, but I didn't know how far it was from there to any kind of help. Could have been another 10 or 20 miles, maybe more. I knew I had more supplies back at the cabin, so I made the hard choice to walk back. The return hike felt worse. Every sound in the woods made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure I was being followed, but I didn't see anything. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was already down. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going, lit every candle I could find, and sat in the chair facing the door. I held a heavy iron fireplace poker across my lap, just in case. In the middle of the night, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves around the cabin. I stood up, holding the poker tight. The steps circled the building, then stopped. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then a soft thud against the door. Not a knock, just pressure, like someone was leaning into it. I stayed like that until the light began to creep in through the windows. When I finally opened the door, there was a smear of dirt on the wood, like someone had pressed a muddy hand against it. I didn't wait any longer. I packed a bag with food, water, and some basic supplies. I left a note on the table explaining where I went, in case anyone found the place after me. Then I locked the door and started walking. I followed the gravel road until it met the main road, then stuck my thumb out for any car that passed. After about an hour, a truck stopped. The driver was a local who gave me a ride into town. I didn't say much, just that my car broke down and I needed help. I called for a tow from a diner, and a mechanic picked up the car that afternoon. It was beyond repair. They towed it back to the shop, and I hitched a ride back home the next day. I never reported what happened at the cabin. There wasn't much to tell. No real evidence. No faces. Just a slow creeping dread that built up over days. I don't even know if it was one person or more. Maybe it was just some backwoods local messing with me. Maybe I was unlucky. Or maybe I was just too alone for too long. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't plan to. I thought I was going up there to get away from everything. But sometimes, what's waiting out in the middle of nowhere isn't peace. It's something else entirely. Something that watches from just beyond the tree line, never close enough to see clearly, but always close enough to hear you breathe. Started as a solo retreat, something I had been craving for months. I had spent most of the past year working long hours at a job that drained me, living in a cramped apartment in the city with noise bleeding in from every direction. My phone buzzed constantly. The air always felt stale, and I couldn't remember the last time I had heard silence that wasn't forced by earplugs. When I finally requested a full week off, I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I packed my Jeep with food, gear, a few tools, and some old paperbacks, then drove north until cell service dropped off completely. I found a small, secluded cabin tucked deep into a forest off a rough gravel road in northern Idaho. It wasn't listed online. A friend of a friend had told me about it. Something their uncle owned and barely used anymore. It was exactly what I wanted. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, no noise but wind through the trees. The cabin was old but solid. One main room, a wood stove, a small kitchen area with a gas stove and sink, and a tiny back room with a cot and a shelf nailed into the wall. The outhouse was maybe 30 steps out the back door, surrounded by thick pine. There was a generator if I needed it, but I planned to keep everything quiet. I didn't even bring a laptop. The first couple of days were perfect. I chopped some firewood, cooked simple meals, read old books by the window, and walked trails that wound through the forest like veins. The weather was cool and dry. I slept deeply, better than I had in years. It didn't feel like a vacation. It felt like remembering something I forgot I needed. By the third night, I was more relaxed than I could remember being. I went to bed early, listening to the wind in the trees. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up to a sound that wasn't the wind. It was dull, like a low knock. Not on the door, more like it came from under the cabin. I lay there for a while, not moving. It was one knock, then silence. I thought maybe it was an animal, a branch dropping, or just something shifting in the wood. Old cabins creak. I pulled the blanket tighter and went back to sleep. The next day was normal. I walked farther than before, finding an old deer path and following it until I saw where it ran near a stream. I filled my bottle, sat on a rock for an hour, and listened to the water. I didn't want to go back, not yet. I think a part of me already felt something was off, even if I didn't admit it. That night, I heard the knock again. This time there were two, and they were louder. The sound came just before I fell asleep, close to midnight again. I sat up this time and listened. The knocks were spaced out, about a second between them, and then nothing. It didn't come from the door or the window. It came from underneath. I got up and stepped onto the cold floor, barefoot, and walked over to the door. The porch was dark, but the moon was bright enough to see the outline of the trees. I stepped outside and shone my flashlight around. Nothing moved. No footprints. No broken branches. The cabin sat on short concrete blocks, maybe 2 feet off the ground. I bent down and shined the light underneath, half expecting to see a raccoon or some other animal. Nothing, just dry dirt and dead leaves. I told myself it was just the wood settling, even though it hadn't made that noise before. I told myself it didn't matter. I slept again. The fourth day felt different. The wind had stopped. The air was heavier. The trees seemed closer somehow, like their trunks had crept inward overnight. I walked again, but this time I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't see anything, but I started carrying the hatchet. That night, I went to bed with the flashlight on the floor next to me. I listened hard before falling asleep. I woke up again around the same time. 3 knocks, slow, heavy, directly beneath the cot. I froze. My heart was racing. The cot had no box spring, no underframe, just a single piece of wood nailed into the wall and resting on a support beam beneath. But the sound had come from under it, below the cabin floor. It wasn't wood shifting. I know that sound. This was different. This was pressure. Contact. I slid off the cot slowly and picked up the flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I crouched by the wall, my bare feet cold against the floor. I waited for another sound. Nothing. I stayed that way for almost 30 minutes, knees starting to ache, hand tight around the flashlight. Eventually I stood up, walked to the kitchen area, and sat at the table. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I walked around the cabin, scanning the dirt under it. No tracks, no disturbed leaves. But I noticed something I hadn't before. A patch of dirt under the backside looked darker, like it had been disturbed more recently. I kicked at it with my boot. The top layer broke loose too easily. It was softer than the rest. I knelt down and brushed it with my hand. It looked like something had been dug up, then buried again. Maybe a small hole, maybe wider, but it wasn't hard-packed like the rest of the ground. I didn't dig it up. I went inside, packed up some food, took my hatchet and flashlight, and hiked out toward the stream again. I needed space to think. I stayed out for most of the day, hiking farther than I had the first time. I saw fresh claw marks on a tree at one point, probably a bear. I walked faster after that. When I got back, the cabin felt colder. The door was closed, but something felt wrong. I stepped inside slowly. Everything was where I left it, but there was a faint smell I didn't remember. Damp earth, like wet roots. I slept with the hatchet in my hand that night. The 5th night, the knocks didn't come from under the floor. They came from inside the walls. For knocks, slow, one after another. I didn't move. I just sat there on the cot, frozen, staring at the far wall. The knocks came from the wall behind the shelf. I knew the walls were just wood boards nailed to studs, with nothing behind them but air and insulation. Nothing should be in there. I got up and walked to the wall, pressing my ear against it. I heard breathing, faint, too slow to be mine, too even to be wind. I stepped back, heart pounding. I backed toward the door, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. I stood on the porch for what felt like an hour. I stared into the woods, listening. I thought maybe it was in my head. Cabin fever, isolation playing tricks. Then I saw movement, not in the woods under the cabin. A figure, low to the ground, not walking, crawling. It moved fast, too fast. It slipped out from one side and disappeared into the trees before I could even raise my light. But I had seen it, pale, thin, bare limbs. I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed everything. I stuffed what I could into my pack and left everything else. I didn't care about food or gear anymore. I hiked out fast, following the trail back to where I had parked the Jeep. It was almost a 3-hour hike uphill. I didn't stop. My legs burned. I could feel eyes on me the whole way. When I reached the Jeep, I found the back window smashed in. Not like someone had broken it, more like something heavy had hit it from the inside. The glass was mostly on the ground behind it. My heart dropped. I opened the driver's door and climbed in. Nothing was missing. The keys were where I left them. I drove. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles from the nearest town. I called my friend, the one who told me about the cabin. I didn't tell him everything, just said something was wrong with the place. He didn't ask questions, said his uncle hadn't used it in years. I drove back to the city the next day. I didn't go back for any of the things I left. I didn't want them. Weeks passed. I had nightmares every night, not of the knocks or the crawling thing, just the silence, the feeling of being watched, the smell of the dirt. I kept waking up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear a sound from under the bed. Eventually, I went to a therapist. I told her it was stress, burnout. She told me to try grounding techniques to walk outside more. I moved to a different apartment. I bought a dog. It helped a little, but every now and then, if the house is quiet enough and the wind isn't blowing and the dog is asleep, I still hear knocking, just once, from the floor. But I never check anymore. I just sit still and wait for it to stop. It was mid-October when I decided to take a break from the noise of the city. I was tired of the traffic, the long hours at work, and the constant ringing of my phone. I had some vacation days saved up, and I figured a quiet week alone in the woods might help clear my head. I booked a remote cabin online that I found through a small listing website. It wasn't advertised as a fancy place, just a simple off-grid wooden cabin deep in the forest, about 2 hours away from the nearest town. The listing mentioned no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and no close neighbors. That's exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long and winding. After a while, the road turned from asphalt to gravel, and then to a narrow dirt trail. Trees grew thick on both sides, and the sky disappeared behind their branches. There were no signs or markers, just the GPS on my dashboard telling me I was still headed in the right direction. Eventually, I pulled up in front of a small, dark brown cabin. It sat just at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by dense trees. There was a small porch with 2 wooden steps, a single door, and 2 shuttered windows. Inside, the cabin was exactly as described, basic but clean. There was one main room with a bed pushed against the far wall, a table, and 2 chairs. A wood-burning stove stood near the center of the room, and there was a pile of chopped wood stacked neatly by the wall. There was no bathroom inside. Instead, there was a small outhouse about 30 feet away from the cabin, just past the tree line. I wasn't thrilled about that part, but I'd committed to the experience. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, gathered more firewood, and lit the stove as the evening chill set in. I brought a cooler full of food and a few books, and I had a small solar-powered lantern that gave just enough light to read by. The silence out there was strange at first. You don't realize how used to background noise you are until it's gone. No cars, no sirens, just wind in the trees and the occasional creak of wood. But I settled in. That night I had trouble sleeping. Not because I was scared, at least not yet. I think it was just the unfamiliarity of it all. The cabin made strange sounds, groaning lightly as it adjusted to the cold. At one point I heard what I thought was a thump outside, but when I looked through the window, I didn't see anything. I figured maybe a branch had fallen or something had knocked over a piece of firewood. I eventually drifted off. The next morning was cold. I stepped outside and walked to the outhouse, rubbing my arms and seeing my breath in the air. There were fresh deer tracks in the dirt nearby, leading into the woods. That made me smile. Felt like I was finally away from everything. I made myself a simple breakfast on a small propane stove I'd brought and spent the rest of the day hiking a short loop I found marked on an old map left inside the cabin drawer. The trail went through thick woods and circled back around after a few miles. I saw squirrels, birds, and even a fox darting between trees. It was peaceful. That evening, while I was reading near the stove, I heard the sound of something moving outside again. This time it was slower, heavier. I paused, listening. It sounded like footsteps, just a few, then silence. I got up and opened the front door. It was nearly dark by then, but the lantern light spilled out onto the clearing. I didn't see anything, but I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. I stayed there a minute longer before going back inside and locking the door. I slept with the lantern on that night. The next day was cloudy and colder. I gathered more firewood and stayed close to the cabin. I kept hearing noises out in the woods. Not animals, Not the light scampering or the fluttering of wings, but something heavier, something walking. More than once I went outside to check, and each time I found nothing. But the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. That night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it again, crunching in the leaves. Close. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I could barely breathe. I got up and went to the window, staying out of the lantern light. I peered out through the shutter. That's when I saw someone. They were standing just at the edge of the tree line, on the side of the cabin. Not moving, just standing there. I couldn't see any details, just the shape of a person. My hands started to shake. I backed away from the window slowly and grabbed the hatchet I had used to chop firewood. I stood in the corner of the room, holding it tightly, listening. The person didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I went back to the window. They were gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The morning after that, I debated leaving. But I convinced myself it was probably a hunter who got turned around in the woods. Maybe they didn't realize there was a cabin there. Still, I kept the hatchet with me all day. I didn't go hiking. I stayed near the porch, watching the woods. I didn't hear anything for hours. I started to calm down. That changed around late afternoon. I found something. It was behind the outhouse. A small piece of red cloth caught on a branch. I hadn't seen it before. It looked like it had been ripped from a shirt. I didn't wear red. I picked it up and stared at it for a long time. It was stiff with dried blood. That night, I didn't light the stove. I didn't want to give off any light. I stayed in bed, fully dressed, with the hatchet under the blanket. I didn't sleep. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps again. They walked all the way around the cabin, slow and steady. Then they stopped right outside the front door. I held my breath, waiting. The doorknob rattled, lightly, like someone testing it. Then silence. I sat there for hours, not moving. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside with the hatchet raised. There were fresh prints in the dirt, clear as day. Boot prints, bigger than mine. That was enough. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even clean up. I just shoved everything back into my duffel bag and cooler and threw them into the car. As I was getting in, I looked back at the cabin one last time. Something was carved into the wood next to the door. I hadn't seen it before. For deep lines, like someone had dragged a knife across the wall. Not once, but 4 times. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I drove away fast, tires spinning in the dirt. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. My phone found a signal shortly after that, and I called the county sheriff. I reported what I saw, the man, the bloodied cloth, the footsteps. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I gave them the address and told them everything. A week later, a deputy called me back. He said they went out there and found signs of someone squatting in the woods nearby. An old tarp, some food wrappers, and a campsite hidden about 200 feet from the cabin. But they didn't find the person. They figured it was someone passing through, maybe a drifter or someone avoiding the law. They advised me not to go back. I never did. I still think about those nights, about the man standing by the trees, the marks on the door, the footsteps circling the cabin. I don't think he was just passing through. I think he was watching me, waiting. And I think if I had stayed just one more night, I wouldn't be here to write any of this. I haven't gone camping alone since. I don't think I ever will. I don't usually travel alone, especially not into the woods, but something about that weekend just made me want to disconnect. Work had been eating me alive. Long nights, stressful meetings, always being on edge. My phone never stopped buzzing. So when I saw a listing for a quiet cabin deep in the Oregon wilderness, I booked it without thinking twice. No reception, no neighbors, just trees and peace. That's all I wanted. I left early Friday morning. My car was packed with supplies, food, firewood, warm clothes, extra batteries, a portable charger, a first aid kit. I had done my homework. The cabin was about 3 hours from the nearest town and was accessed by a rough dirt road that wound through the forest for miles. I followed the GPS until I lost signal. By then, I was already halfway down the road. It didn't matter. The owner had sent directions in a PDF, so I just followed that. It was late afternoon by the time I arrived. The cabin was older than I expected, but sturdy. It sat in a clearing, surrounded by thick trees that blocked out most of the sky. The roof looked solid. The small porch had a pair of rocking chairs and an old axe leaned against the railing. The woods around it were dead quiet. No birds, no rustling, nothing. Just stillness. Felt peaceful at first, like everything was holding its breath. I carried my stuff inside and started getting settled. The place had a main room with a wood stove, a kitchenette, and a table. There was a narrow hallway leading to a small bedroom and an even smaller bathroom. Everything was basic but clean. No TV, no radio, just a battery-powered lantern and a stack of books. I liked that. I liked the silence. That first night, I lit a fire in the stove and made a simple dinner. I sat on the porch after dark and just listened. There was nothing to hear, not even wind. It was strange, but I figured the isolation was part of the charm. I slept early, tired from the long drive. I woke up around 2 a.m. because I thought I heard something, a faint thump. I sat up in bed and listened. Nothing. It was probably a branch falling or some animal outside. Still, I had trouble falling back asleep. I stared at the ceiling for hours, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't name. The next day, I went for a short walk along one of the trails near the cabin. The forest was dense and full of undergrowth. I had to move slowly, keeping my eyes on the uneven path. I didn't see any wildlife, not even squirrels or birds. That felt off to me. I didn't dwell on it, though. I came back, made lunch, read a bit, and chopped some wood just to stay busy. That night, I didn't sleep well either. I kept hearing soft sounds, thumps, creaks. At one point, I thought I heard someone walking on the porch, slow steps moving back and forth. I got up and checked through the window. Nothing, but I still locked the door and made sure the axe was inside with me. By the third day, something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling. I wasn't scared exactly, just uneasy. I noticed small things. The firewood I stacked looked slightly different, like someone had moved it. One of my boots was a few inches from where I left it. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. I told myself it was the isolation messing with me. No phone, no distractions. My mind was making things up. Later that afternoon, I decided to hike a longer trail. I needed to get out of the cabin. The trail started behind the shed and went deeper into the woods. It was narrow and overgrown, but walkable. I followed it for about 40 minutes, marking trees with a piece of chalk so I wouldn't get lost. At one point, I found an old rusted hunting stand. It was up in a tree, probably unused for decades. I climbed halfway but didn't go all the way up. Something about it felt wrong. I kept moving. When I turned around to head back, I noticed something. One of the chalk marks I made was smudged. Not rubbed off by weather or an animal, smudged by a finger. I stared at it for a long time. I even touched it to make sure it wasn't just my imagination. The shape was unmistakable. A fingerprint. I walked back faster, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every snapping twig made me flinch. I made it to the cabin just before dark and locked the door behind me. I didn't eat that night. I just sat near the fire with the axe beside me. I felt like I wasn't alone out there. At around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps again. This time it was clear. Slow steps circling the cabin. The boards of the porch creaked under the weight of someone heavy. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The steps paused near the front door, then moved toward the back. I grabbed the axe and stood quietly by the window. I tried to peek without being seen. There was no one, just darkness. The next morning, I found boot prints in the dirt around the porch, bigger than mine. Deep impressions like someone had been pacing. I wanted to leave, but the road out was long and rough. I didn't feel safe driving it alone if someone was out there. I decided I'd stay one more night and leave first thing in the morning. That day dragged on. I didn't go outside. I barely moved from the couch. I kept checking the windows. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but it was too far to be sure. I was jumpy, tired, and on edge. That final night was the worst. I barricaded the door with a chair and kept the axe close. Around midnight, I heard tapping on the window. Not loud, just soft taps, spaced apart. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. Then it stopped. I waited in silence. Minutes passed. Then I heard it. The sound of someone trying the door handle. Slow, careful. The chair blocked it from moving much, but I could hear it rattle. I stood frozen. Then silence again. I stayed awake all night, heart pounding. The door never opened. The taps didn't come back. But I never felt more alone or more vulnerable in my life. At sunrise, I packed up everything and left. I didn't clean the cabin. I didn't look back. I drove until I reached a gas station and called the police. I told them someone had been stalking me at the cabin. They sent someone to check it out later. The report they filed didn't find anyone, but they confirmed the boot prints. There had been someone out there, someone big, someone watching. I never went back to the woods after that. I canceled every future trip I had planned. I don't hike alone anymore. I don't even camp. That weekend changed me. I went into the forest to escape people, to be alone. But being alone is only peaceful when you're actually alone. Out there, someone was watching me the whole time. They never spoke, never showed themselves, but they were there, waiting, studying, maybe planning something worse. I was lucky. I got out, but I still think about it every time I close a door or walk past a window at night. I don't know who it was or what they wanted. I just know that if I had stayed one more day, something bad might have happened. I don't want to know what. It was the middle of October when I decided to take a break from the noise of the city and go stay alone in a small rental cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I had found the listing online. The pictures showed a simple one-room wooden cabin surrounded by thick forest, sitting by a small lake that didn't even have a name on Google Maps. There were no nearby towns, no cell reception, and no Wi-Fi. That's what drew me in. I needed to disconnect. I packed enough food for a week, mostly dry goods and canned stuff, brought a few jugs of water, a flashlight, a big knife just in case, and some basic gear. I also brought a small axe for chopping firewood. The cabin had a wood stove for heat and a gas stove for cooking. No electricity. It was advertised as off-grid and peaceful, and that's what I wanted. I had been dealing with a lot at work, and my sleep had been garbage for months. I just wanted quiet. The drive there was about 5 hours. The last hour was on a narrow dirt road through the forest. The trees were so thick in some parts that the sunlight barely touched the ground. I had to slow down to avoid hitting potholes or the occasional fallen branch. When I reached the cabin, I parked beside it and got out. It was smaller than I expected, just one window on each side, with a short wooden deck and a single step leading to the front door. The lake was behind the cabin, maybe 30 feet from the back wall. I unlocked the door using the code the owner had sent me and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like pine and old smoke. There was a small cot on one side, a table and 2 chairs on the other, and the wood stove sat in the corner with a pile of chopped logs beside it. The kitchen was basically a shelf with a propane burner and some old cookware. There was an outhouse out back, about 20 yards into the trees. The first day was calm. I unpacked, got a fire going in the stove to knock the chill out of the air, and sat on the deck for a while watching the lake. There were no houses across the water, just trees. The only sound was wind in the branches and the occasional bird. I made a simple dinner of beans and rice, then turned in early. It was fully dark by 7 p.m., and without power, there wasn't much to do once the sun went down. I read by flashlight for a bit, then went to sleep. The first night passed without any problems. I woke up a few times just from not being used to the silence. My apartment back home always had the distant hum of traffic, or people talking through the walls. Out here, the silence was almost too much. I kept thinking I heard something moving in the woods, but it was always just the wind or branches shifting. I told myself I just needed to adjust. The second day, I spent time hiking around the area. There was a narrow trail that went around the lake and looped back toward the cabin. I walked it slowly, listening to the sound of my boots on the dirt and leaves. I saw deer tracks in the mud and a few old stumps where someone had cut trees long ago. I didn't see anyone else. No cabins, no hunters, no signs of other people. felt like I had the whole forest to myself. That night, I built a fire in the fire ring behind the cabin and sat beside it watching the flames. I stayed out until the stars came out, which felt closer than they ever did back in the city. Eventually, I put the fire out and went inside. I checked the door lock twice before going to bed. I don't know why. Something just made me uneasy. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. There was a sound. At first I thought it was a dream, but then I heard it again. A dull thud, like something hitting the side of the cabin. I stayed still in the cot, listening. Another thud, this time on the opposite wall. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. It wasn't an animal, not a deer or a raccoon. It sounded like a hand, or a fist. I got up slowly and picked up the flashlight. The knife was already by the bed. I clicked the light on and walked to the window. I couldn't see anything, just trees and darkness. I waited a few minutes, heart pounding, before opening the door and stepping onto the deck. I shone the light around, but there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches. The air was cold, and the silence was thick again. I went back inside, locked the door, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check for prints. The ground was soft from rain a few days before, and I found something. About 10 feet from the cabin, under a tree, were boot prints. Not mine. They were larger than mine, wider too, and they were fresh. The soil still held the shape. Whoever it was had been there during the night. I followed them a few yards, but they disappeared into the underbrush. No clear trail. I went back inside and stayed there most of the day. I thought about leaving. The cabin was rented for 6 more days, but I kept thinking about those prints and that sound. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a hunter who got lost. Maybe someone just wandered through, but it didn't sit right with me. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to give away that I was inside. I ate a cold meal, turned off my flashlight, and sat in the dark for hours, just listening. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. This time, it wasn't a thud. It was footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps moving across the deck. Then the sound of something pressing against the door. Not banging, just a soft press, like someone testing it. I held my breath. I was sitting on the floor with the knife in my hand. The footsteps moved around the cabin, pausing by each window. I didn't dare move. I just sat in the dark, heart racing, mouth dry. Eventually, the footsteps faded. I waited another hour before moving. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I packed my bag. I decided to leave. It didn't matter that I had paid for the week. I felt watched. I felt hunted. But when I opened the door, something was waiting for me. On the deck, in the exact center, was a rabbit. Dead. It hadn't been eaten. It hadn't been shot. Its neck had been twisted. Beside it was a small bundle of twigs tied with string, like a little symbol or marker. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't touch it. I just stepped over it and went to the car. The car wouldn't start. I tried the ignition again and again. Nothing. The engine clicked but wouldn't turn over. I opened the hood, but I had no idea what to look for. Everything looked fine. No wires cut, no leaks. The gas tank was full. I tried my phone. No signal. I walked to the end of the dirt road, thinking maybe I could get a bar or two of reception. Nothing. Just trees and more trees. I had no choice but to go back to the cabin. I told myself I would try again in the morning, maybe hike to a nearby road. I brought my bag inside, closed all the curtains, and kept the knife beside me. I didn't eat. I just waited for night. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep at all. Just after midnight, I heard footsteps again. But this time, they didn't walk around. They stopped at the front door and stayed there for hours. I heard breathing. Heavy, slow breathing just on the other side of the wall. Then I heard something drag across the wood. Something sharp. A scraping sound back and forth like a knife or a rock. Just before dawn, the sound stopped. When I finally opened the door, the rabbit was gone. The twig bundle was gone. But carved into the deck were 3 letters. Levi. I don't know what it meant. I still don't. That morning, the car started. No problem. I drove fast down the dirt road, barely slowing for the bumps. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 2 hours away. I didn't say anything to anyone. I just filled up and kept driving. I never reported it. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I never went back to that cabin. I tried to find the listing again, but it was gone. The host's profile had been deleted. No trace of the place anywhere. It was like it had never existed. That was over 2 years ago. I still think about it. Sometimes I wake up in the night thinking I hear footsteps. I keep my doors locked and a light on. I haven't been back to the woods since. I probably never will. I went there looking for peace and quiet. What I found was something that wanted me to leave, and it made sure I did. It was early November when I decided to take a break from everything. My job had been eating away at me for months, and the city noise never stopped. I wanted quiet, space, and time. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to check my phone every few minutes. I didn't even want to hear the hum of a refrigerator. I found a listing online for a small off-grid cabin in northern Idaho. No electricity, no cell service, no people. Just a wooden box deep in the trees with a wood stove and a cot. Sounded perfect. I packed the basics. Canned food, a water filter, extra socks, thermal layers, a flashlight, and enough wood and fuel to last a week. I brought 2 knives, a hatchet, a thick sleeping bag, a few old books, and a battery-powered radio. I even brought a flare gun just in case. The drive from the city took about 11 hours. By the time I reached the trail that led to the cabin, it was nearly dusk. There was a small gravel area to park, a locked gate, and a narrow path marked with old wooden signs. The trail twisted uphill through dense forest. The sun was already dropping behind the ridge, and the wind had that bite that cuts through layers. I followed the path for about an hour before I saw the roof of the cabin through the trees. It sat on a slope, surrounded by pines and boulders. There was no other structure in sight. No roads, no cabins, no lights. Just that one weathered building barely held together by time. The cabin was simple. 1 room, wooden walls that creaked when I leaned on them, a small window covered in frost, and a stove in the corner with a rusted pipe that ran out the roof. There was a table, a chair, and a cot. Some old pots hung from nails on the wall. It smelled like dry rot and ashes. Still, it felt peaceful. I unpacked, got the fire going, and settled in. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. That first night was quiet. The only sound came from the fire popping in the stove and the wind moving through the trees outside. I slept early and woke up to birds and cold air. I went out, collected some dead branches and split them for kindling. There was a natural spring nearby, just down the slope. I filled a jug, filtered it, boiled some, and made coffee over the stove. Everything moved slower out there. No alarms, no emails, no deadlines. By the 3rd day, I noticed something odd. Small things at first. The axe I left outside was moved, not far, but it was leaned against the side of the cabin instead of the chopping stump. I assumed maybe I bumped it without thinking. Then I saw fresh boot prints in the mud near the spring. They were heavy, wider than mine, and led into the woods, but not back out. I stood there for a long time just looking at the ground. My chest felt tight. I listened. The forest was still. Too still. But I didn't hear anything. I walked back to the cabin slower than usual and kept checking over my shoulder. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound made me sit up. The wind outside felt heavier. I kept the fire going, but even the warm glow didn't help. At one point, just before I drifted off, I thought I heard something tapping, not from inside, from the side of the cabin. A soft knock, then silence. I held my breath. It didn't come again. I told myself it was just a branch or an animal. By morning, there were more tracks. This time they were closer, right by the door. There was a smear of something dark on the doorknob. It looked like old blood, but I couldn't be sure. I washed it off with snow and went back inside. I locked the door and checked all my supplies. Nothing was missing, but the radio wasn't working. It buzzed faintly but didn't pick up anything, not even static. I tapped the batteries, changed them, tried again. Nothing. I told myself I'd leave the next morning. One more night. I didn't want to hike down in the dark or rush and hurt myself. I kept the hatchet close and didn't light the stove until the sun started setting. I didn't want smoke showing I was still there. As it got dark, I sat by the window with a blanket around my shoulders and watched the trees. Around midnight, I saw something, a shape just outside the tree line. It didn't move. It stood there. I couldn't tell what it was at first. Maybe a stump or a rock. But then it moved. Not fast. Just a small shift, like someone adjusting their stance. I held my breath and leaned back from the window. My heart pounded so loud I felt it in my ears. I waited. I looked again. The shape was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the chair, holding the hatchet, listening. The wind blew harder, whistling through the gaps in the walls. The fire died down to coals. I didn't dare get up to feed it. Every crack in the wood sounded like footsteps. When the sky finally turned gray with morning light, I packed everything as fast as I could. I stuffed food into my backpack, wrapped my sleeping bag, and made sure I had my knife and hatchet ready. I opened the door slowly. The snow was fresh, no tracks yet. I looked around. Nothing moved. About halfway down the trail, I saw something hanging from a branch. It was a piece of cloth. Dark, maybe black or dark brown. It wasn't mine. It looked torn, like it had been ripped off something. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I hiked the rest of the way fast, barely stopping to breathe. My legs burned, but I didn't care. I kept checking behind me. When I reached the car, the first thing I noticed was the passenger door slightly open. Not wide, just enough that I knew I didn't leave it that way. Inside, my glove box had been rifled through. Papers were scattered. The spare flashlight was gone. The batteries I kept in the side pocket of the door were missing. My heart started racing again. I slammed the door shut, locked everything, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the first gas station 2 hours away. I didn't report anything. I didn't have a name or a face or proof. What could I say? That I saw someone maybe? That I heard tapping? That my door was moved? I just drove home. I unpacked. I took a long shower. I stared at the walls. I didn't sleep well for weeks. Months later, I looked up the area, just out of curiosity. I didn't expect much, but I found an old article. A man had gone missing near that same trail years ago. No body was ever found, just his car abandoned and his things still inside. A local hunter reported seeing strange camps in the woods nearby, makeshift shelters, animal bones. No one followed up. I haven't gone back. I won't. I still think about it sometimes, especially when the nights are quiet and I hear something I can't explain. But I remind myself, there was no ghost, no creature, just a person. Someone who knew the woods better than I did. Someone who watched, who waited, who maybe wanted me to stay a little longer. And that's what scares me the most. It was the first week of October when I decided to take a break from everything. Work had been burning me out slowly for months, and I could feel it wearing on my body and mind. My doctor told me to disconnect for a while, go somewhere quiet. So I booked a small old wooden cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. It wasn't fancy, but that was what I wanted. I just needed to be away from people, from noise, and from the constant pressure of screens and deadlines. The cabin was about 3 hours from the nearest town. The road that led to it was a long dirt path that wound through dense forest. By the time I got there, the sun was low and the shadows were stretching out like fingers across the trees. The cabin itself looked worn but sturdy. It had a metal roof, a wraparound porch, and was surrounded by tall pine trees. There were no neighbors for miles. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the occasional call of a bird. Inside the cabin, things were simple. A small kitchen, a wood stove, a bedroom, and a tiny bathroom with a tankless water heater. No TV, no internet, no cell signal. It was exactly what I needed. I unpacked my food, some books, a couple of notebooks, and got the fire going in the stove. I cooked a simple meal and went to bed early. That first night was peaceful. I slept hard. The next few days were more of the same. I hiked some of the trails around the cabin, read for hours at a time, wrote in my notebook, and slept deeply. The air was crisp, the mornings were cold, and everything around me felt still and undisturbed. It had been years since I had felt that kind of peace. But by the fifth night, something changed. I had gone to bed around 10 p.m. after a long walk in the late afternoon. I remember waking up sometime in the middle of the night because I felt cold. The fire in the stove had burned down, so I got up, added some wood, and waited for the heat to come back. As I stood there in the dark cabin, something felt off. It wasn't a noise or a movement, just a feeling in my chest, like something was watching me from outside. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to being alone in the woods, but I still checked the front window. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I went back to bed. The next morning, I found tracks around the cabin. At first I thought it might be a deer or maybe a coyote, but the prints didn't match either. They were human, barefoot, and small, maybe a child's, but they didn't make sense. There were no houses for miles, and the tracks came out of the woods from the west, circled the cabin twice, and then disappeared back the way they came. No signs of shoes, no signs of struggle, and no reason for a kid to be out here in the middle of the night with no clothes or shoes. I spent most of that day trying to forget about it. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe they were just weird animal prints distorted by the morning frost. But that night, I couldn't relax. I kept checking the windows. I locked the door. I kept the fire going bright. I even left the porch light on, even though it attracted moths. Around 3 a.m., I heard something. At first, it was faint, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I sat up in bed and listened. The sound moved, like a hand dragging across the wooden wall outside. Then a soft thump, like someone stepping onto the porch. I grabbed the flashlight and crept out of the bedroom. The cabin was quiet. I looked out the front window, but again, there was nothing. I stood there, not breathing, trying to listen. Then I heard it, a soft creak from the back of the cabin, like the porch boards shifting under weight. I didn't go outside. I waited until the sun came up. When I finally worked up the nerve to go around back in the daylight, I saw more prints. Same size, barefoot. This time, there were more of them. They went right up to the back door, stood there for a while, then vanished into the woods again. That whole day, I felt watched. I didn't leave the cabin. I kept the fire going and stayed inside. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. I started packing. I was already loading up my car when I heard something in the woods behind the cabin. A branch snapped, then another. I froze. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't break branches like that. I waited, but saw nothing. I didn't wait any longer. I drove out of there fast. But a few miles down the dirt road, I had to stop. A large pine tree had fallen across the road. I got out and tried to move it, but it was too big. I didn't have the tools to cut it. I had no cell signal. I had to go back to the cabin. When I got back, the door was open. I know I locked it. Inside, things had been moved. My bag was dumped out on the floor. The chair by the fire was turned over. Nothing was missing, just disturbed. Whoever had been outside was now coming inside. I locked the door again and pushed the dresser in front of it. Then I went to the back and did the same thing. I stayed awake all night, holding a fire poker. I didn't hear anything, but the silence felt worse than noise. The next morning, I grabbed my things and left on foot. I walked down the road, heading for the ranger station I had passed on my way in. It was over 10 miles away, but I didn't care. I walked fast. Every so often I thought I heard something in the trees behind me, but when I stopped, it stopped. It took me almost 5 hours to reach the station. When I got there, I told the ranger everything. He drove me back, but by the time we got to the tree, it was gone, just dragged off into the woods, like it had never been there. At the cabin, the door was closed and locked. Inside, everything looked normal. Even my bag was packed. Nothing was out of place. I could tell he didn't believe me, but he gave me a ride to the nearest town, and I got a motel room and slept for 16 hours. It's been months since that trip. I haven't gone back. I don't hike anymore. I still don't know what was out there, or who it was, but I know what I felt. I know what I saw. It was real. It was human, and it wanted me to know it was there. Sometimes at night, I still hear those soft footsteps in my head, circling, waiting, watching, and that feeling, that cold feeling in the chest, it never really left. It was the first week of October when I drove up to the cabin. The air had already started to shift, colder in the mornings and heavy with the smell of falling leaves. I had rented the place for 10 days, hoping to get away from the stress of my job and the constant noise of the city. The cabin was deep in the forest, about 30 minutes off a narrow highway, and another 15 minutes down a dirt road that got rougher the deeper I went. The trees grew taller the farther I drove, and the sunlight disappeared in patches. By the time I reached the place, my tires were covered in mud, and I could barely see through the dust stuck to my windshield. The cabin was older than I expected. Small, maybe 20 feet across, made of faded wood that looked gray in the shadow of the trees. There was a small deck out front, and a single wooden chair sat crooked on it. The door was unlocked just as the owner said it would be. Inside, it smelled like old pine and dust. There was a fireplace that hadn't been used in years, a small kitchenette, a cot with thin bedding, and a table with one chair. No TV, no Wi-Fi, no signal on my phone. That was the point. I spent the first day just settling in. I unpacked, cleaned the dust off the surfaces, and got a fire going in the fireplace, even though it wasn't that cold yet. It made the place feel less empty. I made instant noodles for dinner and listened to the fire crackle. It was quiet outside, not just quiet like the city at night, but truly still. No wind, no people, no hum of cars or distant voices, just trees and dark. I slept well the first night, the kind of deep sleep that only comes when you're truly tired or truly away from everything. The next morning, I woke up early, made coffee on a small camping stove, then sat on the porch and watched the sun rise behind the trees. It was peaceful. Around noon, I decided to explore the area a bit. There was a trail behind the cabin that went straight into the woods. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The path was narrow, with tree roots and broken branches scattered across it. I walked for about half an hour, just following it, not thinking about anything, just walking. I didn't see any animals, not even birds. That felt strange. I heard rustling sometimes, but I never saw anything. About 2 miles in, I found a clearing. In the center, there was what looked like the ruins of an old structure, maybe another cabin or a shed. The wood had collapsed in on itself. There was a rusted metal drum next to it and a few shattered glass jars. I walked around the remains, trying to imagine what it used to look like. But the weird thing was, I felt like I was being watched. There was no sound, just the feeling that something was nearby. I didn't stay long. On the way back, I marked a tree with a small piece of cloth from my jacket. I figured I might come back again later, and it would help me find the clearing faster. But halfway back to the cabin, I realized I was being followed. I didn't hear footsteps, but I kept turning around, feeling like something was just out of sight. Every time I looked back, the path behind me was empty. Still, I walked faster. My heart was racing. By the time I reached the cabin, I was sweating, even though it was cold. I locked the door for the first time that night. I also moved the chair in front of the door. Felt silly, but I couldn't shake that feeling. I stayed up late, sitting by the fire, staring at the windows. They had no curtains, just bare glass looking out into the dark trees. I kept imagining shapes moving past them, but I told myself it was just the shadows from the fire. The next day, I stayed near the cabin. I chopped some wood, cleaned up the area, read a book, but I still felt on edge. That afternoon, I walked around the cabin and noticed footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were too big, and they came from the woods, stopping about 10 feet from the porch. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to panic, but someone had been near the cabin, and I hadn't heard anything. I thought about leaving that night, but the nearest town was 2 hours away, and the road was rough. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was a hunter or someone hiking. Maybe they saw the cabin and walked over, curious. I stayed, but I barely slept. Every creak of the wood made me jump. I kept the fire going all night, even though I didn't need the heat. On the 5th day, I woke up and saw something strange. My cloth marker was hanging on a branch just outside the cabin. I had left it 2 miles into the woods. Someone had brought it back. I stared at it for a long time. I checked all around the cabin, looking for signs someone had been there again, but the ground was dry, and I couldn't see new footprints. Still, someone had been close enough to hang it where I could see it. That day, I took my hunting knife with me everywhere, even inside the cabin. I kept it beside me when I sat by the fire. I put it under my pillow when I tried to sleep. I didn't go outside after dark. I didn't go back into the woods. I stayed close. I kept the chair against the door every night. On the 7th night, I woke up to a sound. Not from inside the cabin, but outside. It was soft at first, like something brushing against the wall. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then I heard the wooden steps creak. Slow and deliberate, one at a time. Someone was walking on the porch. I sat up, heart pounding so hard it felt like my chest would burst. I grabbed the knife. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't make a sound. I waited. Whoever it was didn't try to open the door. They just stood there for maybe 10 minutes. Then I heard them walk back down the steps and into the woods. I stayed up until dawn, staring at the door. That morning, I finally made the decision to leave. I didn't care about the remaining 3 days. I packed everything fast. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. I just threw my stuff into bags and got in the car. The dirt road out felt longer than before. Every sound in the trees made me flinch. I kept checking the rearview mirror. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a bit of relief. But I didn't stop driving. I made it all the way home in 1 day, barely stopping for gas. When I finally walked into my apartment, I felt like I could breathe again. I locked every door and window. I took a hot shower and sat on the couch for hours. That night, I unpacked. At the bottom of my bag, I found something I hadn't packed. It was one of the shattered glass jars from the clearing. I recognized it by the rust-colored dirt still clinging to it. I didn't know how it got there. I hadn't taken anything from that place. I never even touched the jars. But now one was in my apartment. I threw it out, put it in a plastic bag and walked it to the dumpster a block away. But I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, watching the window, even though I was on the 3rd floor. I kept thinking about the silence in those woods, the way I had been watched, the footsteps, the cloth, the jar. Weeks passed. Nothing else happened. No one followed me. No one contacted me. But I never went back to the woods. I sold all my camping gear. I never rented another cabin. I still don't know who was out there or why they followed me. But I think about it sometimes, when I'm walking home late or when the power goes out and everything goes dark. It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't anything from a movie. It was real. Someone was out there, and they wanted me to know it. It was late September when I decided to take a solo trip up to a remote cabin in the northern part of Washington state. I'd been burnt out from work, constantly stuck in front of my laptop, answering emails that never ended and dealing with meetings that could have been calls. My head felt like it was packed with fog. I needed space, quiet, and distance from everything and everyone. I found this old cabin listing online. It wasn't through Airbnb or any big site. Just a small independent rental I came across on a local forum. It was far from town, nestled deep in a wooded area with no neighbors nearby. The guy who rented it out said it was old but solid and that the view from the back porch was worth every penny. That's all I needed to hear. The drive took nearly 7 hours. Once I passed the last real town, I had to follow a gravel road that curved through dense forest, rising into the hills. My phone lost service about 30 minutes before I reached the place. That part didn't bother me. I wanted to unplug. I pulled up to the cabin just before sunset. It was smaller than I expected, with weathered wooden siding and a tin roof. The place looked like it had seen some harsh winters. The porch creaked under my weight as I walked up to the front door. Inside, the air smelled a little musty, like it hadn't been opened in a while, but not enough to bother me. There was a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen with basic appliances, and a bedroom with a full-size bed. No TV, no Wi-Fi, and only a few lamps running on what looked like a solar-powered battery setup. I spent the first hour unpacking, sweeping out the dead leaves by the doorway, and opening a few windows to let the breeze air the place out. By the time I had dinner, it was dark outside. I sat on the back porch with a flashlight and a book, sipping a beer and listening to the wind rustle the trees. The quiet out there was deep, not like the kind of quiet you get in the suburbs. This was total silence. No cars, no people, no background hum of life. Just the forest and me. That night, I slept fine. The bed was old but comfortable, and I was tired from the drive. I left one window cracked, and the cool night air was perfect. The next morning, I made eggs and toast and took a short hike behind the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading up a slope, and I followed it for about an hour. No signs, no markings, just dirt and fallen leaves. At the top of the slope, I came across an old, rusted hunting blind. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I didn't go near it, just made a note of it and headed back down. The rest of the day, I read, wrote in a notebook, and relaxed. That second night, things started to feel different. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was a tree branch scratching against the window, but when I listened closer, it sounded more like crunching, like footsteps, slow ones, on dead leaves. I sat up in bed and turned off the fan. The noise stopped. I didn't move for a while, just sat there listening. I told myself it was probably an animal. Deer were common up here, maybe a raccoon. I went back to sleep eventually but left the flashlight by my side. The next morning, I looked around outside. I didn't see anything unusual at first, but when I walked toward the back where the trail started, I found boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I had hiked in sneakers. These were heavy treads, like from work boots. The weird thing was they led from the forest edge toward the cabin and then stopped about 20 feet from the back porch. No prints going back, like someone had just stood there, watching. My first thought was a hunter or hiker passing through, but this was private property, and the trail wasn't marked. It didn't sit right with me. I stayed close to the cabin that day, kept the windows shut. Around noon, I heard something thud against the side of the house. I rushed outside but found nothing. Later that afternoon, while I was chopping some kindling, I felt like someone was watching me from the trees. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing. I even yelled out once, just in case someone was messing with me. No response, just silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing little noises, soft thumps, snaps, and crunches outside. At one point, I swore I heard breathing outside the bedroom window, but when I shined my flashlight, I didn't see anything. I stayed up until dawn, sitting on the couch with a fire going and the flashlight in my hand. In the morning, I decided I'd had enough. I started packing up. I figured I'd head out early, maybe stop in town and let the owner know someone might be trespassing. But when I stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Nailed to the tree directly facing the front of the cabin was a dead squirrel. Its body was stiff, and its head had been twisted around. It wasn't there the day before. This wasn't an animal attack. This was placed there by someone. I got in my car and started the engine. The tires spun a bit on the soft dirt, but I got going. The road back out felt longer than I remembered. Every shadow between the trees made me feel like I was being watched. At one point, I had to stop because a fallen branch was blocking the road. A big one, thick and heavy. It hadn't been there when I came in. I got out, dragging it to the side. My hands were shaking. I kept looking over my shoulder, waiting to hear footsteps behind me. When I finally made it back to the paved road, I didn't stop. I drove all the way into the nearest town and found a diner with a payphone. I called the local sheriff's office and explained what had happened. They said they'd send someone to check the property. I didn't go back, not even to get the last of my things. A few days later, I got a call from the property owner. He said the sheriff's office found evidence that someone had been camping out about 50 yards behind the cabin. An old tarp, some beer cans, and a small fire pit. They also found a hunting knife stuck into a log near the trail. No ID, no clear sign of who it was. They figured it might have been a squatter, someone drifting through the woods. That didn't explain the squirrel or the boot prints that led to nowhere, or the feeling I had that someone was always just out of sight. I haven't gone back into the woods since. I still love nature. I still hike. But now I only go to places where there are other people around. Trails with signs, parks with rangers. I learned something important on that trip. It's not the wild animals you need to fear in the woods. It's the people hiding in them. I had been needing a break from work for a long time. I'd been working long hours at the office, barely sleeping, barely eating right, always stuck in traffic, and staring at screens for most of the day. The city had started to close in on me, and I knew if I didn't take a break soon, I was going to burn out completely. I didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to hear anyone talk back. I just wanted silence, real silence. So I started looking for places where I could go off the grid for a while. That's how I found the cabin. It was listed on a forum for outdoorsy people. No pictures, just a GPS coordinate, and a short description from someone who said it was free to use, as long as you left it better than you found it. The cabin was deep in the woods, about 2 miles off a rough trail in northern Montana. The area was remote, no cell signal, no nearby towns, and no neighbors. That's exactly what I was looking for. I packed my gear, bought enough food to last a week, and drove out. The drive took over a day. I stopped to rest once in my car at a gas station. When I finally arrived at the trailhead, I locked my phone in the glove box and left the keys under the mat. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started the hike. It was mid-September, so the weather was cool but not cold. The air felt clean, the sky was clear, and the forest was alive with the sound of birds and leaves rustling. I felt lighter already. The trail wasn't marked, and I had to rely on the GPS I had downloaded in advance. I followed the path, which quickly turned rough and narrow. After a while, even the faint signs of a trail disappeared, and I had to use a compass to make sure I was heading in the right direction. It took me about 3 hours of hiking through thick woods before I saw the roof of the cabin through the trees. It looked old but solid. A single-story wooden structure with a tin roof, maybe 20 feet by 15 feet in size. It was surrounded by tall pines, and there was a small clearing out front. The door creaked when I opened it, and a musty smell came out, like old wood and dried leaves. Inside, there was a cot, a small table, a wood-burning stove, and a shelf with a few dusty canned goods. There was also a hand pump for water in the corner. No electricity, no gas, just the bare essentials. It was perfect. I spent the first day settling in. I unpacked, swept the floor, aired out the mattress on the cot, and started a small fire in the stove to keep warm at night. I boiled some water from the pump and used it to clean the table and wipe down the walls. I cooked some beans and rice on my little camp stove and ate while sitting on the steps outside the cabin. The quiet was almost overwhelming. I hadn't realized how much background noise I lived with every day until it was gone. That night, I slept better than I had in months. No cars, no lights, no buzzing electronics. Just darkness and the sounds of the forest. I woke up once when something rustled outside, but I didn't see anything. Probably just a deer. The next few days were peaceful. I spent my time hiking around the area, gathering dry wood, and reading from a book I brought. I saw a few animals here and there. Deer, squirrels, birds, but nothing strange. I wrote in a notebook for the first time in years. I felt calm. I didn't want to leave. But then, on the 4th day, I noticed something odd. I had gone on a long hike and returned just before sunset. As I was approaching the cabin, I saw a footprint in the dirt just outside the front steps. It wasn't mine. I checked the tread, and it didn't match my boots. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I hadn't seen or heard anyone since I arrived. There was no one else around for miles. The print was fresh. I looked around the woods but didn't see or hear anything unusual. No broken branches, no voices, no other footprints. I went inside, locked the door, and stayed up for a few hours, listening. But nothing happened. I tried to convince myself it was old and I just hadn't noticed it before, but I knew better. The next morning, I went out and checked the area around the cabin more carefully. I found nothing else. No tracks, No signs of someone camping nearby, no trash, nothing. I let it go, thinking maybe I was just overthinking things. On the 5th day, I went for a shorter hike. I didn't want to be gone too long. When I came back, the door to the cabin was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it. I walked up slowly and looked inside. Nothing seemed disturbed. My backpack was where I left it, and nothing was missing. But I noticed something small. The chair at the table was pulled out just a bit, like someone had sat there. I hadn't touched it in 2 days. I searched the cabin top to bottom. There weren't many places to hide. I even checked under the cot and in the cabinets. Nothing. Still, I felt watched. I kept thinking about how isolated I was. If someone was messing with me, I was completely alone. No way to call for help. No signal. No road. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me sit up and listen. I kept the axe next to my cot and the fire going low in the stove. Around 3 a.m., I heard soft crunching outside, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I held my breath, came and went. I didn't move until sunrise. I made up my mind to leave the next day. I didn't care if my time was up early. I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed up my things during the morning, stuffing everything into my pack. Around noon, I heard movement behind the cabin. I crept out the front door and walked around to the back slowly. Nothing, but I felt like I had just missed something. I didn't wait. I threw the last of my gear into the bag and started hiking out. I moved fast, not stopping for water or food. The forest felt different now, too quiet. At one point, I thought I heard someone whistling faintly behind me, but when I stopped, it was gone. I didn't look back. When I got back to the car, everything looked untouched. I got in and locked the doors. I sat there for a few minutes, breathing hard. I didn't feel safe until I had driven 20 miles away. Back in the city, I tried to put it out of my mind. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe someone else had stumbled across the cabin and left without taking anything. But I knew that wasn't it. Someone had been there. Someone knew I was alone. A week later, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went online and tried to find the post where I'd first seen the cabin's location. It was gone. The thread had been deleted. No backups, no comments, nothing. I've never gone back. I still camp, still hike, but I always stay near other people now. I don't take chances anymore. I learned the hard way that sometimes being completely alone isn't peaceful. Sometimes it just means no one can hear you if something goes wrong. I had been planning the writing retreat for months. After a long stretch of burnout, city noise, and distractions, I finally booked a small, remote cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. It was advertised as being completely off the grid. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just a bed, a desk, a stove, and a view of trees. That's exactly what I wanted. No interruptions, no distractions, just me and the words. I left early on a Monday morning, with my car packed full of groceries, notebooks, a laptop, and backup batteries. The drive was long and winding, about 5 hours from where I lived, and the last part of it was a gravel road barely wide enough for my car. The forest got denser the further I drove. The trees towered above everything, and the daylight started to feel dimmer even though it was just afternoon. There were no signs of houses nearby. That gave me a strange feeling at first, but it also made me excited. Total peace. That's what I thought I needed. When I pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly like the photos. Old, simple, and small. It sat on a slight slope with tall pine trees all around it. The driveway ended in a clearing with a patch of flat dirt where I parked. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Everything was quiet. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. The cabin had one front door, no visible back door, 2 small windows on each side, and a little deck with 2 wooden chairs. I unlocked the place and stepped inside. It had a single room with a bed on one side, a little kitchen space on the other, a desk under the window, and a wood-burning stove in the middle. There was a tiny bathroom with a compost toilet and a water jug sink. Simple, just like I expected. That first night was peaceful. I made myself some pasta on the propane burner, set up my laptop and notebooks, and sat on the deck with a mug of tea while the sun dropped behind the trees. The silence was strange at first. I could hear every sound: branches creaking, squirrels running across the roof, little noises that I wasn't used to. But after a while, it started to feel nice, calming. I went to sleep early that night, tired from the drive and hopeful that I'd wake up ready to write. The next few days followed a good rhythm. I'd get up early, make coffee on the little stove, sit at the desk and write for hours, take breaks to walk around the woods, and then come back and write some more. The piece was doing something to me. I wasn't checking my phone, I wasn't thinking about work, and the words started to come easier. On the third morning, something small but strange happened. When I got back from my usual walk through the trees, I noticed the front door was slightly open. Not wide, just barely cracked. I was sure I had closed it. The air outside was calm. No wind. I figured maybe I hadn't latched it all the way. I went inside and looked around. Nothing looked out of place. My laptop was still there. My notebooks were untouched. The groceries were fine. I shrugged it off, locked the door behind me, and got back to writing. But that night, while lying in bed, I kept thinking about it. The door, it had definitely been closed. I always made sure to close it fully. It wasn't like a spring-loaded one. You had to push it and then twist the handle to lock it. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I couldn't fall asleep for a while. The next morning, I made a point to check everything before going out. I closed and locked the door tight, even pulled on the handle to make sure. I left the cabin around noon for a longer hike, bringing a water bottle and snacks. I was gone for maybe 4 hours. When I came back, everything looked normal at first. The door was still closed this time. But when I walked in, I noticed something off. My laptop screen was lit up. I was sure I had closed the lid. Not only that, but one of the drawers on the desk was open. I never used it. I always kept my notebooks out in the open. I checked inside and saw nothing missing, nothing I even recognized as mine. Just an old folded up map and a broken pencil. I started to feel uneasy. Maybe someone had come in. Maybe someone was watching the cabin. I checked all the windows. They were shut tight. There was no sign of forced entry. The lock on the front door was fine. Still, I had a bad feeling in my stomach. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every little creak made me sit up and stare at the door. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I stayed in the cabin all day. I didn't go for my usual walk. I sat at the desk, trying to write, but I couldn't focus. I kept looking at the door. I kept glancing at the window. I felt stupid, like I was letting my mind run wild. But something was wrong. I could feel it. In the afternoon, I decided to test something. I placed a small piece of paper inside the gap between the door and the frame. If someone opened the door even just slightly, the paper would fall. I also laid a small stick just inside the entry, angled in a way that it would be disturbed if someone stepped in. Then I left. I didn't go far, just down the trail for about an hour. I came back as quietly as I could, slowly walking up to the cabin. My heart was pounding. When I reached the door, the paper was gone. The stick was slightly moved. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the door. I didn't want to go inside, but I forced myself to. I walked in slowly. Everything looked the same, but the cabinet under the sink was open now. I hadn't opened it. Inside, nothing was missing, just some cleaning supplies and an old bucket. I closed it again. That night, I brought a chair over to the door and wedged it under the handle. It was an old trick, but I hoped it would help me sleep better. I also kept a heavy flashlight near my bed, just in case. I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint sound, a soft creaking. The chair was still in place. The door hadn't moved. I waited, listening, barely breathing. Then I heard it again, a different sound, this time from the window. It wasn't banging or scratching, just a gentle tap, like something brushing against the glass. I didn't move. I just lay there with the blanket up to my chin and stared into the dark. Eventually, it stopped. I don't know how long I stayed awake. I must have fallen asleep just before dawn. When morning came, I rushed outside and checked the ground under the window. There were faint marks in the dirt. Not footprints exactly, just signs that something or someone had been standing there. I packed my bags that morning. I didn't even eat breakfast. I loaded everything into the car and didn't bother cleaning up. I had 3 days left on the rental, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. As I backed out of the clearing and started down the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. There was someone standing at the edge of the woods near the cabin. Not close, but close enough to see their outline. Tall, thin, just standing there completely still. I didn't stop driving. I didn't even slow down. I kept going until I reached the highway. Then I drove straight home. I never reported it. I never told the rental company. I just left a key in the Dropbox like they told me to. I didn't want to explain what happened. I didn't even know how to explain it. Nothing had been stolen. No real proof anyone had broken in. Just signs. Small signs, but enough to make me leave. It's been a few months now. I still think about that place sometimes. I still wonder what was really going on. Maybe someone lived in those woods. Maybe they watched the cabin and waited for people to leave during the day. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they were looking for food. Or maybe they just liked being inside someone else's space without being seen. Whatever it was, I know I'll never go back to a remote cabin again. That silence I thought I wanted, it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that hides things. And now I know better. It was early November when I decided to take a break from everything. The stress at work had been piling up for months. I was tired of the noise, the routine, and the constant buzz of city life. I booked a week off and found a small, quiet cabin deep in the forest, a few hours outside of town. It wasn't a fancy Airbnb or anything. It was just an old hunting cabin I found listed on a backwoods rental site. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no neighbors. Exactly what I wanted. The drive out was long and the road got worse the deeper I went. It started as pavement, then gravel, and then just packed dirt. Leaves covered most of the road and I had to slow down, carefully dodging potholes and fallen branches. The forest on either side was thick, mostly pine and oak. It looked untouched, like no one had been through there in months, maybe years. After a while, the GPS gave up. I relied on the directions I wrote down. I found the cabin around 3 p.m. It sat on a slight rise, surrounded by trees, with a small clearing in the back. There was a fire pit and an old, rusty swing tied to a tree branch. The place looked old but solid. The wood siding was weathered, and the roof had moss on it. But the door was strong, the windows intact, and it had a stone chimney. Inside was small and simple. One main room with a bed, a wood stove, a table, and a small kitchenette. There was no bathroom, just an outhouse about 50 feet away behind the cabin. The smell of old wood and dust was strong, but not unbearable. I unpacked my stuff and stacked the food in the cooler. I had brought enough canned goods, dry snacks, and bottled water for the week. I had a flashlight, spare batteries, a knife, a hatchet, and a map of the area. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire pit, listened to the wind move through the trees, and stared at the stars. I hadn't seen that many stars in years. The sky was pitch black, and the silence was perfect. I slept well, wrapped in a thick blanket with the wood stove giving off a gentle warmth. The second day, I explored a bit. I hiked the trails near the cabin, following a narrow path that led down to a dried-up creek bed. Animal tracks were everywhere. Deer mostly, but some looked different, bigger. I figured maybe a bear had passed through. I kept my knife close, just in case. I didn't see any people, no campers, no hunters. Just squirrels, birds, and the occasional distant crack of a branch. That night, I noticed something strange. Around midnight, I heard a soft crunching outside, like footsteps, slow, careful steps. I turned off the lantern and listened. The sound circled the cabin, then stopped. I waited. My heart was beating fast. I didn't move. After a few minutes, it started again, this time near the back. Then nothing. I didn't sleep much after that. The third day, I found something odd by the outhouse. Pile of rocks, stacked neatly, 6 of them. They weren't there before. I checked the area but saw nothing else. No footprints, no tools, just the rocks. I kicked them over, thinking maybe some animal had moved them, but it felt deliberate. That night, I set up a tripwire using fishing line and some tin cans. Nothing fancy, just enough to make noise if something came close. I placed it between two trees near the back window. I also brought the hatchet inside and kept it beside my bed. Around 2 a.m., the cans rattled. I jumped up, heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight and hatchet. I didn't turn on the light yet. I crouched near the window and waited. I heard the same slow footsteps. Crunch, pause, crunch. Closer this time. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it out the window. Nothing. The beam only lit up a few feet in front of me. The trees swallowed everything beyond. I turned off the light and waited. Eventually, the sounds faded. I barely slept again. In the morning, I found the tripwire torn. Not broken by wind or accident. It had been cut. Clean. The cans were gone. I searched the area but found nothing. My gut told me someone was out there. Not an animal. Someone. Maybe a squatter or some weirdo living in the woods. I considered leaving, but part of me didn't want to overreact. That afternoon, I walked further than before. I found an old deer blind, high in a tree. Looked like it hadn't been used in years, but something about it felt off. There were fresh boot prints near the base, bigger than mine. I followed them a bit, but they disappeared in the underbrush. That night, I blocked the door with the table and stacked firewood against it. I didn't want any surprises. I kept the fire low so the light wouldn't draw attention. I didn't hear anything that night, but I didn't sleep much either. I felt watched, like every creak of the cabin was someone creeping inside. The fifth day, I decided I had enough. I packed everything, loaded the car, and tried to start it. Dead. The battery was completely drained. It had been fine 2 days before. I checked the hood. Everything looked okay. No chewed wires. No loose connections. I tried again. Nothing. Just clicking. I sat in the car for a while thinking. My phone had no signal. No internet. The nearest town was miles away. I could try walking, but it would take hours. And if someone was out there walking through the woods didn't feel safe. That night, I barely kept it together. I lit a fire, stayed inside, and waited. Around 3 a.m., I heard the cans again, but I had brought them back inside the cabin. These were different. Somewhere outside, someone was shaking metal. Then came the sound of tapping. Slow, steady tapping. On the walls. First on one side, then another. Like fingers. Not hard, just enough to make noise. I sat in the corner with the hatchet, flashlight ready, not moving. The tapping went on for nearly an hour. Then silence. The next morning, I found deep gouges in the wood near the back window, like someone had dragged a knife across it, again and again. I knew I had to leave. I packed a backpack with food, water, a map, and the flashlight. I left a note in the cabin explaining where I was going in case someone found it. I locked the cabin behind me, not that it mattered, and started walking west, following the trail I came in on. I walked fast, trying not to stop. The forest felt heavier, like it was pressing in on me. I kept checking over my shoulder. Every sound made me jump. At one point, I found another rock stack. 6 rocks again, right in the middle of the trail. I kicked it over and kept moving. About 3 hours in, I stopped to rest. That's when I saw something in the trees. Just for a second. A shape, tall, not moving, watching. I pretended not to notice and started walking again. Faster this time. After what felt like forever, I found the main dirt road. Relief hit me hard. I followed it for another mile before I saw a truck. An old forestry vehicle, parked near a trailhead. I ran to it. No one was around, but the door was unlocked. The radio worked. I called for help. 2 hours later, a ranger arrived. I told him I had gotten stranded and didn't mention anything else. He gave me a ride into town. I called a tow truck and had my car hauled back. The mechanic said the battery had been drained intentionally. It wasn't age. Someone had tampered with it. I never went back to that cabin. I told the owner I left early and didn't give a reason. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I only know I was lucky to get out, and I've never gone into the woods alone again. I needed a break. That was the only thought that stuck with me through the long drive up into the mountains. I had been working non-stop for over a year, hardly taking a weekend off. My sleep schedule was wrecked, my eating habits were worse, and I felt like a walking corpse. So, when my cousin offered me the keys to his small hunting cabin up in the northern range, I didn't hesitate. He warned me there was no cell signal, no electricity, no plumbing, and the place hadn't been used in years. That was fine with me. I didn't want screens or emails or even people. I just wanted to sit somewhere quiet for a few days and let my brain settle. The road to the cabin turned from asphalt to gravel and then to dirt. It wound through thick pine forest, steep ridges, and long stretches of nothing. By the time I got there, it was late afternoon. The sun was low behind the trees. The cabin was about what I expected. Old, wooden, slightly tilted. It stood on a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. No other cabins or buildings were in sight. I parked the car and stepped out. The air was cold, even though it was early fall, and the wind cut through the trees like a whisper. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The place smelled like old wood and dust. There was a fireplace, a small table with 2 chairs, and a single bed with a worn-out mattress. A few pots and pans hung from hooks on the wall. There were shelves lined with canned food. I checked the expiry dates. Most of them were still good. The place was basic but livable. I spent the first evening settling in. I unpacked my things, lit a fire in the fireplace, and made a simple dinner. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the shadows inside the cabin grew longer. I sat near the fire, wrapped in a blanket, reading a book by flashlight. The silence was deep. There were no distant cars, no planes overhead, just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin as it settled. The first night passed without much incident. I slept okay, considering the mattress was hard and the wind outside made it sound like something was brushing against the walls. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small trail that led deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while, saw deer tracks, a squirrel, even a bear print that looked old. I took pictures, but without signal, I couldn't upload them or send them to anyone. That was fine. I liked it that way. By the third day, I started to notice things that didn't sit right. They were small at first. I left my flashlight on the table before going to bed, but in the morning it was on the floor. I figured it might have rolled off. I heard noises at night, not just wind or trees creaking, but distinct snapping sounds, like footsteps on twigs. I told myself it was probably animals, maybe raccoons or deer, nothing to worry about. The next night, I heard what sounded like breathing outside the window, not heavy or obvious, but soft, steady breathing, the kind someone makes when they don't want to be heard. I stayed frozen in my bed for over an hour, gripping a small hunting knife I had brought with me. When I finally gathered the courage to check, there was nothing outside, just darkness and trees. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks on me. I hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Maybe the isolation was messing with my head. But still, I started sleeping with the knife under my pillow. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the cabin. Not animal tracks. These were human, barefoot. They circled the cabin and led into the woods. I followed them for a bit, but they vanished into the underbrush. That day, I hiked farther than before. I wanted to find any signs of people nearby. Maybe another cabin, maybe a trail that led to civilization. I didn't find anything, just more woods. By the time I returned, the sun was going down. I saw smoke rising from the chimney as I approached. I had put the fire out before I left. When I stepped inside, the fire was lit. Someone had been there. My bag was moved. My clothes were disturbed. Nothing was missing, but someone had touched my stuff. I grabbed the knife, looked around the cabin, checked under the bed, inside the cabinets. No one was there. I ran outside and circled the building. No one, just trees and shadows. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against the wall, knife in hand, staring at the front door. Every now and then, I thought I heard movement outside, branches cracking, leaves rustling, but no one came. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things, loaded the car, and turned the key. The engine clicked but didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead. I opened the hood. Nothing seemed obviously wrong. I checked the battery terminals. They were fine. The battery had been drained somehow. I hadn't left the lights on, and I hadn't used the car since I arrived. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time trying to think. There was no signal, no other cabins. No one knew exactly where I was. My cousin had given me vague directions, but I hadn't told anyone else. If I wanted help, I'd have to walk. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and the knife. I locked the cabin and started down the dirt road. I figured it was about a 12-mile walk to the main highway. I could make it in half a day if I kept moving. I had walked for maybe 2 hours when I realized I was being followed. I didn't see anyone, but I heard the sounds. Footsteps behind me, sometimes close, sometimes far. I stopped several times and looked back. Nothing. The forest was thick on both sides. Anyone could hide easily. I kept walking faster now. My nerves were shot. I was sweating, heart pounding. Every little sound made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Once I saw movement between the trees. A figure, pale, thin, not wearing a shirt. It disappeared before I could focus on it. I started running. I ran until my legs gave out. I collapsed near a bend in the road, gasping for air. I didn't hear footsteps anymore, but I didn't feel safe either. I got up and kept moving. Eventually, I reached the main road. A logging truck passed and I waved it down. The driver pulled over, looked at me like I was insane, and let me climb in. I told him I had car trouble. He didn't ask questions. He drove me into town. I called a tow truck and had my car brought in the next day. The mechanic said the battery had been drained manually. Someone had messed with the wiring. I never went back to that cabin. I told my cousin what happened, and he just shrugged, said he never had any trouble up there, but he hadn't used the place in years. To this day, I don't know who was watching me. I don't know what they wanted, but I think they would have come inside eventually if I hadn't left. Maybe they were waiting for something, or maybe they just liked watching. All I know is I won't ever go that deep into the woods alone again. It was late September when I decided to get away from the city for a few weeks. I had been working nonstop, no breaks, no vacations, and the stress was piling up in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I wasn't sleeping right. My appetite was off. I had this constant weight pressing down on my chest. So I took a leave from work, packed up some essentials, and rented a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect. No neighbors, no noise, just trees, a lake, and time. The cabin sat near the edge of a thick forest. Behind it, the woods stretched for miles. In front of it, a narrow dirt road curved through tall pines and ended at the cabin's gravel driveway. Beyond that was the lake, cold, still, and surrounded by reeds and jagged rocks. The closest town was about an hour away. I brought enough supplies to last the whole time I planned to be there. Food, water, some tools, a few books, my sleeping bag, and a shotgun that had belonged to my grandfather, just in case. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time chopping firewood, fishing, reading, and hiking small trails behind the cabin. Every night I sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the water. It was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. No hum of traffic, no sirens, no people talking, just the sound of wind rustling through trees and the occasional owl hooting in the dark. It took me a while to get used to the silence, but after the third night, I started to really enjoy it. One morning I woke up early, before the sun had fully risen. I stepped outside to breathe in the cold air. Everything was covered in dew. The trees glistened, and a thin mist hovered over the lake. I remember thinking how perfect the morning felt. But when I went around to the back of the cabin, I noticed something strange. The shed door was open, I was sure I had locked it. I kept a small axe, some spare gas canisters, and basic tools in there. It wasn't much, but enough to be worth locking up. When I stepped closer, I saw muddy footprints leading in and out of the shed. My stomach dropped. They were boot prints, big ones, definitely not mine. I didn't have neighbors. I didn't have visitors. Nobody was supposed to be out here but me. I walked inside carefully, keeping quiet. Everything looked like it was still there, but it was hard to tell. I didn't have an inventory of every item in there, so maybe something small had been taken. Maybe not. I locked the shed up again and walked back inside the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't go hiking. I didn't fish. I just kept checking the windows. Every sound in the woods put me on edge. I kept glancing at the trees, expecting someone to step out. I even took the shotgun down from its spot over the fireplace and loaded it. It was an old pump action, nothing fancy, but it still worked. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lantern on and the shotgun close. At some point in the middle of the night, I heard something outside. At first, it was soft, like twigs snapping underfoot. Then it got closer. I sat up in bed and held my breath. More snapping. Then something brushing against the cabin wall. I got up slowly, picked up the shotgun, and tiptoed toward the window. I stayed low and peeked through the side. I couldn't see much, just trees, the edge of the shed, and darkness. But the noise had stopped. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting to hear something else, but everything was silent again. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found more footprints. They were around the side of the cabin this time. I followed them as far as I could before they disappeared into the woods. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me felt like I might be overreacting. Could have been a hunter or some hiker who got lost. Still, I didn't feel right about it. I started locking the cabin door every time I was inside, even during the day. 2 days later, something worse happened. I had gone out to collect firewood. It was around midday, and I was about 20 yards from the cabin when I saw movement in the window. Just a quick flicker, like someone stepping away from it. I froze. My first thought was that maybe it was a reflection, maybe just my own paranoia. But something inside me knew better. I sprinted back to the cabin. The door was closed, locked just like I had left it. I unlocked it, pushed it open slowly, and stepped inside with the shotgun ready. Everything looked normal at first, but when I got to the kitchen, I saw something that made my skin crawl. One of the drawers was open. I never left them open. It was just one of those habits I had. And inside that drawer, one of the knives was missing. That night, I barricaded the front and back doors with furniture. I nailed some boards across the windows from inside. I filled the wood stove and stayed in the corner of the room with the shotgun in my lap. I didn't light the lantern. I wanted it to be dark. I figured if someone tried to break in, I'd hear them before they saw me. The night dragged on minute by minute. I kept my eyes on the windows, ears straining for any noise. At around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The slow crunch of footsteps on gravel. Then silence. Then a faint scraping sound, like something brushing against the side of the house again. My heart was pounding. I was sweating even though the fire had long died out. I didn't move. I just sat there waiting. And then nothing. Just like before, it stopped suddenly. In the morning, I went outside with the shotgun and walked around the cabin. This time, the prints led all the way up to the back wall. There were scratches on the wood near the window, like someone had been trying to pry it open. I didn't even feel scared anymore, just exhausted, angry. I wanted to catch whoever was messing with me. That afternoon, I packed my things into the truck and drove to the nearest town. I found a small hardware store and bought a trail camera, the kind hunters use to track deer. I got some extra batteries and memory cards. When I got back, I set it up facing the shed and another one watching the path leading from the woods. I strapped them to trees and angled them just right. If someone came back, I'd see their face. The next few days were quiet again. I started to think maybe I had scared them off. Maybe they realized I was armed and ready. But I still checked the trail cams every morning, switching out the memory cards. It became a routine. On the fourth morning, I saw something. The first few pictures were just squirrels, birds, branches swaying in the wind. But then, around 2:40 a.m., one of the cameras caught something else. A man, tall and thin, wearing a dirty jacket and jeans. His face was half covered by a hood. He was standing near the shed, just staring toward the cabin. The next picture was taken 5 seconds later. He was closer, then the next, closer still. He never looked directly at the camera, just straight ahead toward me. I stared at the pictures for a long time. My hands were shaking. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I knew he wasn't just some lost hiker. He had come back more than once. He had taken a knife. He had been right outside my window. I left that same morning. I packed up everything in less than an hour. Didn't even bother cleaning up. Just threw it all in the back of the truck and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors. When I got back to the city, I turned the photos over to the police. They took a report, asked a few questions, and said they'd look into it. I don't know if they ever did. I never heard back from them. I didn't care. I wasn't going back there anyway. I still think about it sometimes. What would have happened if I had stayed longer? What if I hadn't gotten that trail camera? What if I had actually come face to face with him? I don't like thinking about those questions, but they come whether I want them to or not. Since then, I haven't taken another solo trip. I don't hike alone. I don't camp far from other people. I still keep that shotgun close, even at home. I know the woods are big, and there are a lot of places someone can hide. Someone who doesn't want to be found. Someone who watches from the trees and waits until you let your guard down. I didn't let mine down again, and I never will. I needed a break from everything. Work was becoming too much. The constant meetings, deadlines, and pressure were building up. I could feel it in my shoulders, tight and heavy, like I was carrying something I couldn't put down. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just packed up my old SUV, tossed a few clothes, food, and camping gear in the back, and headed north. I had a cabin booked deep in the forest of northern Idaho, a few miles off the main road and even further from anything resembling civilization. The cabin was one I found online, a small place, barely more than a single room with a kitchen and a bathroom. No internet, no cell service. That was the whole point. I didn't want to hear from anyone. I didn't want to check emails. I didn't want to think. I wanted quiet. I wanted air that smelled like trees and not like office carpet. I wanted to wake up to silence, not alarm clocks. It was a 7-hour drive. The roads narrowed the farther north I got, going from 4-lane highways to winding 2-lane roads, and eventually to gravel paths that cut through thick trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows through the pine trees. The place looked exactly like the photos. Wood-paneled walls, a porch with 2 old chairs, and a metal chimney sticking out from the roof. It looked like it had been built 40 years ago and maybe cleaned once a year since then. There was no one around, no other cabins nearby, no parked cars, no distant sounds of people. Just trees, wind, and the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and dropped my bag on the old wooden floor. The cabin smelled like wood and dust and something else, maybe mildew or just age. I didn't mind. I opened a window to let in fresh air and started unpacking. The first day was fine. I made a simple dinner, read a bit, and went to sleep early. The bed was uncomfortable and creaked every time I moved, but I was tired enough that I didn't care. The quiet was strange. Not bad, just something I wasn't used to. No cars passing by, no buzz from electronics, just the occasional creak of wood as the cabin settled and the sounds of nature outside. The second day, I spent time exploring the area. There was an old trail behind the cabin, not marked, but well worn enough to follow. I walked a few miles into the woods, following the twists and turns, taking pictures, and stopping every so often to just breathe and listen. The forest was thick and green, with moss growing on rocks and trees, and the air smelled clean and sharp. That night, I noticed something strange. I was brushing my teeth in the small bathroom when I heard something outside. It was faint, like a branch snapping or maybe a small animal running through the underbrush. I paused and listened, toothbrush still in my mouth. There it was again. A soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. Then another. I turned off the light and moved to the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The moon was hidden behind clouds. Everything outside was just shapes and shadows. I figured it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. This was the forest, after all. Animals lived here. I tried not to let it bother me and went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up at every sound. The wind pushing against the walls, something scurrying across the roof, a loud thump from the woods. The next morning, I went outside to look around. I found tracks in the dirt near the porch. They weren't boot prints, but they weren't paw prints either. They were strange, wide at the front and narrow at the back, almost like a distorted bare foot. I bent down to take a closer look. The tracks led from the woods to the side of the cabin, then disappeared behind it. I walked around the cabin but didn't find anything else. No trash disturbed, no windows broken, just those strange prints and the feeling that someone had been near me while I slept. I told myself it was probably a bear or some other animal. I even convinced myself the shape of the prints could have been caused by mud sticking in a weird way. I didn't really believe that, but it was easier than thinking someone had come that close. That day, I stayed near the cabin. I kept the door locked. I listened. I kept checking the windows. Every time I heard a noise, I went to see what it was, but I never saw anything. I ate canned soup for dinner and didn't turn on any lights once the sun went down. I sat in the dark, watching the windows, heart beating faster than it should. Around midnight, I heard it again. A slow, dragging sound against the wall. Then a dull thud. Something was out there. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the front window. I didn't want to shine the light yet, not unless I had to. I just wanted to see a shape, movement, anything. But there was only darkness. The dragging sound came again. This time, it was on the backside of the cabin. Then something scraped against the back door. I turned the flashlight on and aimed it at the back window. I saw a shadow move quickly, low to the ground. Then nothing. I waited for a long time before going back to bed. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked again. This time, I found marks on the back door. Scratches low to the ground like something had clawed at it. But they were too wide for a raccoon or a fox, and too shallow to be a bear. It didn't make sense. I looked for more tracks but found none. I thought about leaving. I really did. But I told myself I was overreacting. I had one more night. I could make it. That day, the weather turned. Clouds rolled in and it got colder. I stayed inside, pacing. My nerves were on edge. Every sound made me jump. I kept thinking I saw things out the corner of my eye. A movement behind the trees. A flash of something dark behind the shed at the edge of the clearing. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. That night was the worst. The wind howled through the trees. Rain tapped against the roof and windows. Thunder rolled in the distance. I tried to stay calm. I built a fire in the old wood stove to keep warm. I ate the last of the food I had brought. And I sat, wrapped in a blanket, flashlight in hand. Around 1 a.m., I heard it. A sharp knock on the side of the cabin. Then another. Not a tree branch. Not an animal. This was deliberate. Slow. Measured. Like someone tapping their fingers against the wall. Then footsteps. Slow, steady, circling the cabin. I stood up and turned off the flashlight. I didn't want to be seen. I crouched near the bed, waiting, listening. The doorknob jiggled. Once. Then again. I held my breath. Then everything went quiet. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The fire had died down, and the room was getting cold. I stayed like that until the sky started to lighten. When morning finally came, I packed up everything. I didn't eat. I didn't clean. I just shoved everything into my bag and got out. The forest was quiet as I drove down the gravel path. Too quiet. I kept checking the rearview mirror. When I got to the nearest town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time. I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to tell anyone. What would I even say? That someone stalked me in the woods? That something circled my cabin? That I didn't sleep for 2 days and nearly lost my mind? I thought about going to the police, but what would I tell them? I had no proof, no photos, no witnesses, just scratches on a door and a few odd prints. They'd nod and smile and write it down, but they wouldn't believe me. I drove home, locked all my doors, and didn't leave for 3 days. Even now, weeks later, I keep checking the locks before bed. I wake up at night, thinking I hear something outside, and I haven't gone back into the woods. I don't think I ever will. I needed to get away. My mind was tired. I wasn't sleeping well. Work was eating at me. I had become short-tempered with people. I wasn't eating right, and I was drinking more than usual. I knew I had to stop everything for a while before I burned out completely. I didn't want to see people or hear traffic or check my phone every 5 minutes. I wanted silence and nothing else. I found a place online, a small, off-grid cabin deep in the forest near an old logging area up north. The pictures were simple: a wooden structure with a deck, a wood stove, and a small creek nearby. There was no electricity. Water came from a pump. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. It was about 12 miles from the nearest town and around 4 miles from the last point where the gravel road ended. You had to hike in. That was perfect for me. I packed everything I needed: canned food, dry stuff like oats and pasta, a camp stove, matches, a hunting knife, a flashlight with extra batteries, a headlamp, a solar charger, a small axe, a sleeping bag, a thick jacket, and a few books. I also brought my old notebook and a pen, because I thought maybe I'd feel like writing. I was planning to stay for 10 days. When I arrived at the trailhead, I parked the car near a closed gate that had a faded sign saying, "No vehicle access beyond this point." It was late morning. I slung my pack over my shoulders, locked the car, and began the hike in. The air smelled clean, like pine and damp earth. The sun was out, but it was cold. The kind of cold that doesn't go away even when you're moving. The trail was mostly flat at first. Then it wound down into a valley. Trees got denser. At some points, I couldn't see more than 30 feet ahead. After a while, the path turned rocky and steep. There were no markers, but I followed the directions I had printed. Eventually, I reached a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It looked just like the photos. Weathered wood, a pitched roof, a narrow porch with a railing made from thick logs. There was a woodpile stacked against the side and a water pump beside the cabin. No one was around, just trees in every direction. The only sound was the wind in the branches and the occasional bird call. Felt perfect, like I had dropped off the face of the earth. I unlocked the cabin door with the key the owner had mailed me. The inside was small but clean. A bed pushed against the back wall, a cast iron stove in the corner, a small table and chair, some shelves with old tins and tools, and a few pans hanging from nails. The windows had wooden shutters that could be closed from the inside. The first thing I did was check the stove. It was clean and still had a few ashes from the last person. I opened the metal hatch and added some kindling from the box nearby. The owner had left a fire starter log and a note saying to conserve firewood, as they only restocked it in summer. I lit the fire and sat down. For a long time, I didn't move. I just listened. It was so quiet that I could hear the fire crack and pop like it was speaking. That night, I made a simple meal: rice and canned beans. I sat by the fire and ate slowly. Outside, the wind had picked up. I had closed the shutters, but I could still hear it rush through the trees like distant traffic. Before I went to sleep, I made sure everything was in place. The door was locked. The fire was safe. My flashlight was by my sleeping bag. I fell asleep fast. The first 2 days went smoothly. I cut some extra wood during the day and carried water from the creek to boil and filter. I took long walks, staying close to the cabin. I left small markers. Sticks leaned against trees, stones stacked, to make sure I could find my way back. I didn't see any animals bigger than a squirrel. No other people. The air was dry and cold. The nights were darker than I had ever seen. On the second night, I stepped outside for a piss and looked up. The stars were so bright it almost didn't look real. But on the third day, something changed. I had gone a little farther from the cabin than before, maybe 2 miles out. I walked down a shallow slope toward an old creek bed. It was dry but lined with smooth stones. I followed it, not looking at the time. Then I saw it. Something that didn't belong. A rope nailed into a tree. It was old and frayed, like it had been there for years. The tree it was nailed into had grown around the rope in places. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. Then I looked around. Something about the air felt wrong. Heavier, quieter. I noticed small scraps of cloth stuck to a bush nearby. Faded red fabric. Maybe from a shirt. I took a few steps back and looked up. That's when I saw what looked like a structure. Not a cabin, just a crude lean-to made of branches and bark. It was maybe 30 feet from the rope. It was falling apart, but someone had built it at some point. I didn't go inside. Something in my gut told me not to. I walked in a wide circle around it, eyes scanning the forest. My mouth felt dry. I started heading back. I moved faster than usual. The whole time I felt watched. That night I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing sounds outside. Nothing loud, just branches cracking, like something stepping lightly. Maybe a deer, maybe not. Around 3 a.m., I got up and opened one of the shutters just a little. I looked out, shining my flashlight in quick flashes. Nothing. Still, I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, heart pounding. In the morning, I told myself I was overreacting. Just some old trash from hunters or campers years ago. But I didn't leave the cabin that day. I spent most of the time cutting more wood and checking over my supplies. I counted my matches, made sure my knife was where I left it. I even repacked my backpack in case I had to leave early. That night, things got worse. I woke up to a sound. Something tapping on the cabin wall. Slow, like a finger knocking. 3 taps. Then silence. Then again. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. My flashlight was beside me. I grabbed it and waited. The tapping stopped. I stayed awake, listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Slow. Then the creak of wood under weight. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart was slamming in my chest. I clicked the flashlight on and pointed it toward the door, but I didn't see anything. The steps creaked again. Then nothing. I waited for hours. I didn't sleep. When daylight finally came, I opened the door slowly and looked around. There were faint marks on the porch. Not footprints exactly, just smudges. Something had been standing there. I wanted to leave, but I wasn't sure if I could make the hike back in time before nightfall. I stayed another day but didn't go outside much. I kept checking the window, listening. Nothing happened during the day, but that night it came back. This time it was louder. Footsteps moving in a circle around the cabin. Then scratching. Not hard, just soft, like a nail dragging on the wood. I held my knife and flashlight all night. I didn't sleep. The next morning I decided to leave. I packed everything fast. I didn't eat. I filled 2 water bottles and left the rest. I didn't even put the fire out properly. I just closed the stove door and left. I didn't want to be there another night. The forest was silent as I walked. The trees felt tighter. I kept looking back. Nothing, but I still felt it. Something not right. About an hour into the hike, I saw something on the trail. Pile of rocks. Fresh. Someone or something had stacked them. I hadn't seen them when I came in. I walked around them and didn't touch them. Another hour passed. I started to hear something behind me. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then it sounded like footsteps matched to mine. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. I didn't look back. I just walked faster. I reached the car by late afternoon. My legs hurt. My back was soaked in sweat. I unlocked the door, threw my bag in, and drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was several miles away. Nothing was there. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I said I cut the trip short because of the weather. That was easier. I couldn't explain what I had seen, or what I hadn't seen but still felt. Weeks passed, then a month. I looked up the area out of curiosity. I found an old article. Back in the 1980s, a man had gone missing in those woods. He was a hunter. They found his campsite but never found him. His gear was still there. No signs of struggle, just gone. Another article mentioned strange shelters found by rangers, but no one was ever arrested or blamed. The forest just swallowed things sometimes. I never went back. I deleted the listing from my bookmarks. I stopped hiking for a while, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the house and it's quiet, I think I hear those same soft footsteps on the porch, and I wonder if whatever I felt out there ever left. It was late September when I drove up into the woods of northern Idaho, a place I hadn't been to before. I had taken 2 weeks off from work, something I rarely did, and I decided I wanted to disconnect from everything. No cell service, no internet, just the quiet. I booked a small, old cabin off a back road deep in the woods. The listing said it used to be a ranger station back in the 60s, but had since been converted into a rental. The photos made it look simple but cozy, with stove, outhouse, solar-powered lights, one bed, and a creek nearby. It seemed perfect. The drive took longer than expected because once I got off the highway, the dirt roads were rough. I stopped a few times to check if I was still going the right way, but I eventually found it. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. No other houses for miles. It looked like it hadn't been painted in years, and the wood was dark from years of sun and rain. I didn't mind though. It was what I wanted. Isolated, quiet, simple. I parked my SUV on the dirt patch outside, unloaded my gear, and took a slow look around. There was a small shed to the left of the cabin, locked with a rusted latch. I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just where the owners stored firewood or tools. The cabin door stuck a little when I opened it, but it swung open with a groan. Inside, it was just like the pictures. One room with a bed, small table, stove, shelves with some old books and board games, and a few windows. The place smelled like dust and old pine. I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and by nightfall I had a fire going in the stove. The first night was quiet. I slept well despite the unfamiliar sounds of the woods. The wind moved through the trees in long, soft waves, and every now and then I'd hear something small crunch through the leaves, probably a raccoon or rabbit. I woke up once when I heard something tap lightly on the window, but it could have been a branch or a bug. I wasn't worried. The next day I went for a hike. I brought a map with me which had a few old ranger trails marked out. I followed one for a few miles through thick forest and across shallow streams. The trail hadn't been maintained in years. Branches hung low, and fallen trees blocked the path. I didn't see anyone all day. No hikers, no campers, nothing. By late afternoon, I made it back to the cabin, legs sore and covered in dirt and small scratches. I washed off in the creek, cooked some food, read for a bit, then went to bed. That night was different. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside. It was slow, heavy, like a person walking through the dry leaves and sticks. It circled the cabin once, then everything went quiet. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. I thought maybe it was a deer, but it seemed too slow, too steady. After a while, I fell asleep again. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. I found something strange behind the cabin. The leaves and dirt had been disturbed in a clear path, like someone had walked through the same spot over and over. There were no shoe prints, just mashed leaves. I stared at it for a long time, then shook it off. Maybe it was just an animal pacing. Maybe a moose or a bear, though I hadn't seen any signs of them. I decided to stay close to the cabin that day. I chopped wood, made coffee, and read for hours. In the evening, I walked down to the creek to refill my water container. The water was clear and cold, and the rocks at the bottom were smooth and round. As I filled the jug, I looked up and noticed something across the water. A tree with deep scratch marks down the side, wide and rough. It wasn't there yesterday. The scratches were fresh. I walked over and ran my fingers across them. Something big did this. The marks were too wide for any common animal, and they went high up the trunk, at least 7 feet off the ground. I looked around. The woods were still. No wind, no birds, just quiet. I suddenly felt watched. I backed away, finished collecting water, and went back to the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep well. Around midnight, I heard movement again. Slow, steady footsteps, circling. Then a sound near the back wall, like something leaning or pressing against it. I got out of bed, picked up the hatchet I kept near the door, and stood still in the dark. The fire had gone out, and the room was freezing. I stood there for maybe half an hour, listening, waiting. The sounds eventually stopped. I relit the fire, stayed awake till dawn. The next day, I was tired and on edge. I decided to hike to a nearby ridge where I could maybe get cell service. It was a steep climb. I kept stopping to look over my shoulder. Every now and then I thought I saw movement in the trees, a shadow, a flicker, but when I stared at it, there was nothing. I reached the ridge by noon, no signal. I sat there for a while, eating trail mix, scanning the forest below. From up there, the cabin looked so small. The trees around it were thick, almost like they had grown closer since I arrived. On my way back, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Off the trail, about 50 feet, was a small pile of rocks. A cairn, but not a marker like hikers use. This one looked messy, almost angry, like someone had dumped the stones in a hurry. I walked over. Beneath the rocks was something dark. I kicked one aside. Beneath the pile was a torn piece of fabric. Camouflage, like from a jacket. I backed away and left it alone. My chest felt tight the rest of the way back. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep. The cabin felt wrong, like it was shrinking around me. Every creak in the wood made me flinch. Around 3 a.m., something slammed against the back wall, hard. I jumped up, heart racing, grabbed the hatchet again. The sound didn't come again, but I stood there for hours, sweating, shaking. At first light, I packed everything into my SUV. I decided to leave. I didn't care that I had days left on the rental. I couldn't take it anymore. When I walked around to load the firewood I'd bought, I saw something carved into the back wall of the cabin. Deep gouges, letters. It said, "Go back." I dropped the wood and ran to the car. I drove fast down the dirt road, fishtailing around corners. Every bump felt like something grabbing at the tires. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I drove 5 more hours to a motel. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just said the cabin was too remote. When I got home, I looked up the place online again, but the listing was gone. No rental, no reviews, nothing. Like it never existed. I even tried looking on maps, but nothing showed up. I thought about reporting it, but what would I even say? Weeks passed. I started to sleep again, slowly, but every now and then I wake up to a sound I heard up there. A slow step in dry leaves, a hand brushing wood. I keep my hatchet next to the bed now. I don't think I'll ever go into the woods again. And the scariest part? I still don't know if someone was living out there, watching me, or if it was someone who used to live there who never really left. It was early October when I decided to take a solo trip up north, far away from the noise of the city. I had been working straight for 6 months without a break, and everything felt heavy. My head, my chest, even my bones. I needed to disconnect from everything. I found a listing for a small, off-the-grid cabin in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It was isolated, tucked between thick forest and a small lake that didn't even have a name on the map. The pictures showed an old wooden structure, maybe built in the 60s or earlier. It had a wood stove, an outhouse, and no cell service. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive took over 8 hours. By the time I turned onto the last gravel road, it was close to sunset. The trees were tall and pressed close to the road, their leaves orange and red and brown. I kept the windows down. The smell of pine and cold air filled the car. I remember feeling calmer the closer I got. I hadn't felt that in a long time. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the pictures. The wood was darker, the roof slightly crooked, and one of the windows had been taped around the edges. But it was clean inside and it felt solid. The front door stuck a little, and I had to push hard to get it open. Inside was simple. One room with a bed against the wall, a table and 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a shelf full of canned food. There were stacks of chopped wood outside and a rusted axe leaned against the wall. The first night was quiet. I made a small fire in the stove, lit a few candles, and read from a paperback I had brought. It got cold quickly, but the fire warmed the cabin fast. I slept in my clothes under 2 thick blankets. Sometime in the night, I thought I heard something outside, maybe a branch snapping or a small animal, but I didn't pay it much attention. The next morning, I took a walk down to the lake. It was about a 10-minute walk through the woods behind the cabin. The lake was still like glass. I didn't see any fish or birds, just trees reflected in the water. I sat there for a while on a fallen log, just breathing, not thinking about anything. When I got back, I chopped some wood to keep busy. I boiled water for instant coffee and sat on the front steps with my cup in hand. There was no sound except for the wind moving through the trees. No cars, no people. It was perfect. I stayed that way for hours. That night, I woke up to a noise. Not loud, but clear. It was a knock, just one. Then silence. I sat up and held my breath. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it was probably something falling. An animal, maybe. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I lay back down, but I didn't fall asleep right away. The next few days followed a routine. I made small meals, read, took walks, chopped wood, sat by the lake. I wrote a little in my notebook. I was starting to feel okay again, like my mind was slowing down. But every night I kept waking up. Not always to a sound, sometimes just a feeling. I'd open my eyes and stare into the dark, and the cabin would feel smaller than before. On the 4th night, I heard footsteps. Light ones. They circled the cabin once. I was sure of it. I didn't have any weapons, but I picked up the axe and stood by the window. I couldn't see anything. I didn't have a flashlight, only candles. I didn't light one. I just stood there in the dark until the footsteps stopped. Then I waited. Nothing. It was almost morning when I finally sat down. I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, and I couldn't see any prints. I checked the axe blade. It was still there. I tried to tell myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Later that day, I hiked further out, deeper into the woods. I found an old trail that looked barely used. It led uphill, and after maybe an hour, I came across a clearing. There was an old truck there, rusted through, completely dead. The grass had grown tall around it. I didn't go near it. Something about it felt wrong. I turned back quickly and went straight to the cabin. That night, the knocking came again. 3 knocks this time, then nothing. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited for more, but nothing came. The fire in the stove had died. The room was cold. I felt sick. I didn't sleep. The next day, I packed my bag. I planned to leave in the morning. I couldn't shake the feeling anymore. I felt watched. The trees didn't feel peaceful now. They felt too close, too still. That evening, I sat inside with the axe next to me. The sun went down fast. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want the light. I just sat there. I had my keys in my pocket and my boots on. Around midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps, slower this time. They moved toward the back of the cabin. Then the window creaked. I stood up and grabbed the axe. I stayed still. There was breathing now, soft just outside the window. Not an animal, not the wind. I couldn't see a face, but I knew something was there. My heart pounded. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Then the breathing stopped. I stayed standing until the sun came up. I didn't sleep. As soon as there was light, I got in my car and drove. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I drove straight home, 12 hours with only one stop for gas. When I got back, I emailed the owner of the cabin and told him I left early. I didn't say why. I didn't leave a review. I didn't answer his message. It's been months now. I still don't sleep well. I keep an axe under my bed. I check my windows every night. I don't camp anymore. I haven't gone back to the woods, and I never will. What was out there? I don't know. Maybe someone living off the grid, maybe someone watching the cabin. Maybe something worse, something human but dangerous. All I know is that it was real. No ghosts, no monsters, just danger. And I was lucky to get out when I did. It started as something I thought would help me. I'd been feeling burned out for a long time. Life had become too fast, too noisy, and too packed with things I didn't care about anymore. I wasn't happy with my job. My body felt tired all the time, and I was snapping at people for no reason. I needed a break, a real one, not just scrolling my phone on a weekend or taking a nap on a Sunday. I found the cabin online. It wasn't a rental or a resort thing. It was a private place owned by an older guy named Harold, who didn't really advertise it. A coworker of mine mentioned it one day when we were talking during lunch. She said her uncle had a place out near the border of Washington and Idaho, deep in the woods, a good 3 miles from the nearest paved road. It had a wood stove, a hand-pumped well, a small generator, and not much else. No Wi-Fi, no signal, no distractions. I offered to pay. She just smiled and said, asterisk, he lets people stay if they need space. Just respect the land. Asterisk, that's all he asked. The idea of being alone out there sounded perfect. I packed the basics. Enough food for a week, water jugs just in case the well pump didn't work, a hatchet, bear spray, sleeping bag, books, a notebook, a flashlight, extra batteries, a battery-powered radio, and all my layers. The drive from Spokane took a few hours. Most of it was on normal roads, then it turned into gravel, then dirt. By the time I reached the small clearing with the cabin, the sun was halfway down the sky and the air smelled like pine and old leaves. The cabin was small but solid. A simple log structure with a sloped roof and a porch that looked like it had been rebuilt recently. There was a rusted mailbox nailed to a post out front with no number on it. A stone chimney rose from the side. No glass in the windows, just wooden shutters you could bolt shut at night. Inside, it was one big room, with a cot in the corner, a table, a few chairs, shelves with old books, some canned food, and a pile of dry wood stacked neatly next to the stove. I remember feeling at peace when I first stepped in. The silence was total. No traffic, no voices, just the sound of wind moving through trees. I unloaded my stuff, checked the stove, tested the well, it worked, thankfully, and ate a cold sandwich. That first night, I lit a small fire in the stove and read by lantern light. I fell asleep to the sound of popping wood and my own breath. The first couple of days were what I'd hoped for. I hiked around the area. The woods stretched in every direction, but there were signs that someone had lived there a long time. Old barbed wire half buried in trees, a rusted tractor near a creek, and even what looked like a collapsed shed about a mile away. I made little mental maps of the place as I walked. I'd leave small piles of rocks at key spots so I could find my way back. I didn't wander too far. I respected the land like she said. It was the third night that I noticed something odd. I had gone to sleep like usual. Stove burning low, shutters bolted, doors locked. But sometime in the night, I woke up feeling like I'd heard something. Not an animal, something heavier, like a step. But when I sat up and listened, there was nothing, just the wind. In the morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. I saw something strange in the dirt near the back wall. It was faint, but it looked like a heel print. Not a boot, not clear enough to be sure, but something about the shape made my stomach twist a little. I told myself it was probably mine from earlier, or an animal that just looked human at the right angle. Still, that day I carried my bear spray everywhere, even inside the cabin. That afternoon, I walked further than usual. I wanted to clear my head and stop thinking about the print. I followed the creek south until the trees got denser and the ground started sloping up into rocky hills. I found a spot where I could sit and eat a snack, looking down across the trees. For a while, I just sat in the quiet, listening to the birds and the occasional crack of branches. Then I noticed something off in the distance. It was a shape, just for a second, between two trees maybe 100 yards away. It looked like someone standing there, but when I blinked and looked again, it was gone. I stared at the spot for a long time. Nothing moved. I waited until the air felt colder. Then I turned around and walked straight back to the cabin without taking detours. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept listening for sounds outside. Once, just before dawn, I thought I heard a branch snap. I didn't move. I lay there under my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling. The next morning, I saw something that made me pack my gear, and seriously consider leaving. There were 2 small stones stacked on the porch steps, perfectly balanced. I hadn't put them there, and I didn't believe wind or animals could have done it. They were too carefully placed. I stood staring at them for a full minute. My heart was racing. My first instinct was that someone had come in the night, maybe just messing with me, maybe a hunter, or worse. But the truck was parked a good 20-minute walk down the trail. I would have heard an engine, and there were no fresh tire tracks or footprints in the dirt near the trailhead. Still, I told myself I might have missed something, or maybe a hiker came through, saw the cabin, and left without disturbing anything. Maybe the rocks were just a coincidence. I didn't believe it, but it helped me calm down. I didn't want to leave. I had driven so far. I had taken time off. I told myself I was being paranoid. I put the rocks in my pocket and tried to focus on my book. That day, I barely went outside. I stayed near the cabin. Every time the wind picked up, I jumped. I kept checking the windows and the lock on the door. I started to feel like I was being watched. Not constantly, just every now and then. Like someone was out in the trees, standing just far enough back to blend in. That night, I bolted the shutters tight. I pushed a chair under the doorknob. I kept the lantern burning low and stayed awake longer than usual. Around 2 a.m., I finally started drifting off. That's when I heard it. 3 slow knocks, not on the front door, on the back wall. The sound was soft but clear, not like an animal brushing up against the cabin. These were knuckles. I knew that sound, that hollow, dry knock on old wood. I sat there frozen. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited. Nothing else happened. I didn't go to the back of the cabin. I didn't open the shutters. I didn't even make a sound. I waited until the sky turned gray. Then I grabbed my bag, my flashlight, and every piece of food I could carry, and I left. I didn't even put out the stove fire. I just walked. I didn't stop to look back. I made it to the truck just after sunrise. The tires were fine. Nothing was broken or touched. I got in and drove fast down the dirt road, faster than I should have, tires kicking up dust behind me. But I didn't go home. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station. It was about 40 miles away. I told them someone had been near the cabin. I didn't mention the stones or the knocking. I just said I saw signs of someone watching me. The ranger nodded like he'd heard that before. He asked me where the cabin was, and when I gave him the location, his face changed a little. He said he'd send someone to check it out, but it might be a few days. The area was remote and not patrolled often. I gave him my name and number and left. 2 days later, I got a call. The ranger said they went to the cabin. Everything looked normal. The stove was out. The door was shut, but they found something strange in the woods behind it. About 100 feet from the back wall, they found a small circle of rocks. Inside the circle was a pile of bones. Animal bones, picked clean, arranged carefully. On top of the pile was a piece of cloth. He asked if I had left anything behind. I said no. He paused, then said the cloth looked like it came from a jacket. I asked what color. He said red. I had brought a red windbreaker with me. I hadn't noticed it missing. That night, I emptied my backpack, and the jacket was gone. I didn't sleep well for weeks after that. I kept thinking about the knocking, the feeling of being watched, the stones on the step, the shape in the woods. I never went back to that cabin. I don't think anyone should, but I still think about it, about how whoever or whatever was out there never hurt me, never spoke, never broke in. They just watched, and they wanted me to know it. I was 32 when I decided to spend a week alone in a remote mountain cabin, far from the nearest town. I had just gone through a breakup and needed a break from everything. Work, people, noise, the internet. I found this cabin listed online. It was cheap, looked decent in the pictures, and most importantly, it was isolated. The listing said it had no Wi-Fi, no TV, barely any cell reception. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed enough supplies to last 8 days. Food, water, a gas stove, a few blankets, flashlights, batteries, a knife, and a first aid kit. The drive took about 5 hours from the city. The last hour was the roughest. I had to drive on a gravel road that twisted through thick woods and climbed steadily uphill. My small SUV struggled in a few places, but it got me there. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. It was old but sturdy, a simple wooden structure with a sloped metal roof. One bedroom, one bathroom, a tiny kitchen, and a main room with a wood stove. There was an old shed about 30 yards away, closer to the tree line. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. I could hear birds and the occasional creaking of trees swaying. It was peaceful. The first 2 days were calm. I spent my time reading, hiking short trails near the cabin, and writing in a journal. I chopped some wood, made small meals, and went to bed early. The quiet was strange at first, but I got used to it. There were no headlights on the horizon, no humming of electricity, no voices, just wind, trees, and the occasional animal. On the third night, things started to feel off. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up needing to pee. I got out of bed and used the small bathroom. As I walked back to the bedroom, I noticed something odd through the front window. The shed door was open. I was sure I had closed it earlier that day. I even remembered locking the rusty latch because it kept swinging in the wind. I stood still, staring out into the dark. My flashlight was on the table. I grabbed it, turned it on, and aimed it at the shed. The beam wasn't strong enough to show much, just the open door and blackness beyond it. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no movement. I waited for several minutes, then went back to bed. But I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I checked the shed. The door was still open. I looked inside. There were only a few tools: a rusty shovel, a handsaw, some nails, and an empty metal toolbox. Nothing seemed touched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I closed the door and wedged a thick branch through the latch since the lock was old and useless. Later that day, I hiked a bit further into the woods. I wanted to clear my head. I didn't go too far, maybe a mile or so. The trees were thick, and the path was barely visible, just some flattened grass and broken branches. I stopped when I came across something strange. It was a pile of rocks stacked neatly in a triangle shape, about 3 feet tall. Nothing too weird by itself, but it didn't look natural. It looked arranged. Someone had done this. There were no signs of a fire, no trash, nothing around it. Just rocks. When I got back to the cabin, it was late afternoon. I tried to shake off the uneasiness. Maybe some other hiker or camper made the rock stack. Still, I felt watched, like something in the trees had seen me and followed me back. I kept the flashlight and the knife next to me that night. That night, I heard footsteps outside, light, crunching ones, like someone walking slowly through the pine needles. I stayed still in bed, barely breathing. The sound circled the cabin once, maybe twice, then faded. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I found footprints around the cabin. They were barefoot, human. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the prints were clear. Narrow feet, long toes, no shoe tread. They circled the cabin and led toward the woods. I didn't follow them. I stayed inside most of the day, only stepping out briefly to relieve myself. I didn't eat much. My stomach felt tight. My hands were shaky. I kept the knife in my pocket even indoors. That night, I locked the front door and dragged a chair under the knob. I blocked the back door with a small table. I shut the curtains and stayed awake. Around 1 a.m., I heard tapping. Not knocking, just slow tapping on the window beside the kitchen. Then on the front door. Then the bedroom window. I didn't move. It lasted for maybe 5 minutes. Then silence. Then the footsteps again, circling. I sat in the corner of the room with the flashlight and knife. I waited until dawn. The next morning, I checked outside. The shed door was wide open again. The branch I used to wedge, it was lying on the ground a few feet away. The footprints were back. More of them, still barefoot. This time, they led from the shed to the cabin, to the window, to the back door, then off into the trees. I checked the shed. The handsaw was gone. I went inside, locked up again, and seriously considered leaving. But the problem was I had no cell service, and the nearest town was at least an hour away by car. If someone was stalking me, Driving off meant risking being followed or blocked on the road. I wasn't sure if it was safer to stay or go. I decided to stay one more night, then leave at first light. I didn't want to drive in the dark. That afternoon, I packed everything. I filled the gas tank in a small container I had. I double-checked the car, made sure the tires were okay, and moved it closer to the cabin just in case. I kept the knife on me and found an old hammer in one of the kitchen drawers. I also pushed a heavy wooden dresser in front of the door after dark. That night was the worst. I heard heavy breathing outside the window. It was deep and slow. It wasn't an animal. It stayed there for a long time. Then it moved, and I heard the breathing again at the other window. Then silence. Then a loud bang on the wall. Another. Then something scraped against the wood. The dresser shook. The windows rattled. I stayed completely still. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep. I watched the front door until the sun came up. As soon as it was bright enough, I grabbed everything, threw it in the car, and drove. I didn't look back. On the way down the gravel road, I found a dead deer on the trail. It was fresh, blood still wet, but it had no head, just a clean cut where the neck should be, like it was sawed off. I drove around it. I reached the main road by late morning and finally got signal. I called the rental company and reported everything. They didn't seem surprised, just said sorry and that they would check it out. I didn't ask questions. I drove straight home and didn't stop. Back in the city, I told no one for a while. I couldn't explain any of it. There were no names, no faces, no real proof. Just footprints, sounds, a missing saw, and fear. A lot of fear. A month later, I searched for the listing again. It was gone. The entire page was deleted. I tried looking up the address. Nothing came up. No recent listings, no property records. Like it never existed. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I'll never go back to any cabin alone again. Ever. It was early October when I decided to take a break from everything. I'd been working non-stop for nearly 9 months, barely seeing anyone or doing anything besides work and sleep. My job wasn't something physically hard, but it wore me down mentally. Sitting in front of a computer screen 10 hours a day drained me more than I thought it ever could. So I decided to go away, somewhere far, somewhere quiet, somewhere without people. I booked a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. It wasn't a luxury cabin. It was the kind of place that didn't even have internet or cell reception. Just a wooden structure surrounded by forest, with a wood stove, some basic furniture, and a well nearby for water. That's all I wanted. I needed a break from screens and noise and people. The drive took longer than I expected. After the paved road ended, there was a narrow dirt trail that led further into the woods. It had rained a day or two earlier, and the dirt road had turned into a slippery, muddy mess. I was driving a small SUV, but even that struggled on the rough terrain. Branches scratched at the sides of the car, and several times I had to get out and move fallen limbs off the road. When I finally reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, casting golden light through the tall trees. The cabin looked older than in the photos, but it still seemed solid. The wood was weathered, but the door and windows were intact. There was a small porch with a couple of worn chairs, and a stack of firewood was neatly piled beside the door. The clearing around the cabin was just big enough to let in some sunlight. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air inside was cool and dry, smelled like wood and old dust. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove and a counter with a few shelves. A large wooden table sat in the center of the room, and against the far wall was a bed with a heavy blanket folded neatly at the end. A wood stove stood in the corner, with a metal chimney rising up through the ceiling. I unloaded my bags, set up my things, and started a small fire in the stove. The wood caught quickly, and soon the warmth started spreading through the space. I had brought enough food for a week. Canned goods, dried food, bottled water, and a few treats. I didn't plan to leave until it was time to go back. The first night was quiet. No cars, no people, not even the hum of electricity. Just the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional sound of wind through the trees. I read for a bit, ate a simple meal, and went to bed early. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I made coffee on the propane stove and walked around the area. There was a narrow path that led further into the woods, and I followed it for about half a mile. The forest was dense but beautiful. Tall pines and firs, thick underbrush, and the smell of wet earth. I didn't see any wildlife besides birds and squirrels, but I knew bears and cougars lived in the area. I had brought bear spray just in case. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I'd wake up early, make coffee, go for a walk or sit on the porch, then read or write in a notebook. I didn't miss my phone. I didn't miss the internet. I felt like I could finally breathe. But on the fourth night, something changed. It started with a sound outside. I was sitting by the stove, reading a book, when I heard something move just beyond the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to catch my attention. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal running through the brush. It sounded like footsteps, slow, heavy ones. I stood up and listened. For a few minutes, there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I turned off the lamp and let my eyes adjust to the darkness. I moved to the window and peered out. The moon was bright, casting shadows across the clearing. I couldn't see anyone. No movement, no sign of anything strange. But I could feel it. Something was out there. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed with the fire down low, listening. I kept the bear spray next to me. Every creak and rustle outside made my heart jump. Eventually, I dozed off, but I woke up tired and on edge. The next morning, I walked around the clearing, looking for signs of animals or people. I didn't see any tracks, but the ground was covered in leaves and pine needles. It would have been easy to move through without leaving a trace. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe even a bear, but it didn't feel right. I'd heard animals in the woods before. This felt different. That night, it happened again. I heard the same slow, heavy footsteps outside, but this time they circled the cabin. I stayed in the dark, standing near the window, trying to see something, but again there was nothing, just the sound. At one point, the footsteps stopped right outside the window. I held my breath. I was too scared to move. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew something was there. Then, nothing. Silence. It was like whoever or whatever was out there was waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I considered leaving, but the thought of driving that muddy road in the dark made me stay. I decided I'd leave first thing the next morning. I spent the rest of the day packing and keeping watch. I didn't go for a walk. I didn't sit on the porch. I kept the fire going and stayed inside. That night, everything felt still. Too still, like the forest was holding its breath. I stayed fully dressed, boots on, bags packed, ready to leave the second the sun came up. I sat in the corner of the cabin, away from the windows, with the bear spray and a heavy flashlight in my hand. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time they were faster. Not running, but not slow either. They moved quickly around the cabin, then stopped. Then I heard scratching at the back door. Not pounding, not trying to break in, just a light, slow scratching. It lasted for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. A few minutes later, it came from the front door. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Eventually, it stopped. I waited for what felt like hours. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows. I grabbed my bags, opened the door, and practically ran to the car. Everything outside looked normal, peaceful even, but I didn't trust it. I started the car and drove as fast as I could down that muddy road, not stopping once. When I got back to town, I went straight to a motel. I needed to be around people, around lights and noise. I stayed there for 2 nights before heading home. I never figured out what was out there. I didn't see anyone. I didn't find any proof. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't my imagination. Someone or something was watching that cabin, walking around it, waiting. I haven't gone back since. I haven't even looked at the photos I took while I was there. I don't want to remember that place. I wanted peace and quiet, but I found something else. Something I don't ever want to find again.